Drew, what's going on, man?
Too much, as always.
Dude, it's a good thing that like you're not having to do this with a feather pen, right? Like
I
I
can
see
only
all
imagine.
I see all the books you put out, and I'm like, just like 2 people ago, you'd have to write this by with like a feather, right? And I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah, I thought about that with C.S. Lewis and Tolkien sometimes. I'm like, geez, typewriter? Ugh,
right, right.
sounds awful.
Dude, I did a podcast on here with Kim Peterson about Hugh Nibley.
Yeah.
And we all know how much Hugh Nibley just like he was really good about his sources, right? But like I can't imagine having to bookmark that much stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then have to like just do all that. Like he'd have notes, binders and binders full of resource, where he got it. And so as he's footnote and stuff,
Yeah.
he would just have to like write all that and then type it all out. And I'm like, ugh, ugh. I mean, and then, research wise, right? We're so blessed with the internet that we can find so much stuff now.
Oh, it speeds things up enormously. It really, really does. I remember, 15 years ago, be writing something, and every once in a while, I'll be like, oh, crap, what am I going to do? I'll go
Yeah.
visit the library and check it out and see what I can find, because
Right.
Google just wasn't the same. And you know now you go to Grok 3 and it gives you citations of what pages it went to and everything. Do
So
your work for you. But
are you using that? Are you using AI yet?
not for my writing.
Okay.
I've used it for a few things just out of curiosity and to try and understand topics a little bit better, because there's so much crap out there. um, I really like being able to just conglomerate all the sources together. I'm very distrustful of them still, because they incorporate a lot of bias of the programmers, a lot of bias
Right.
of the articles they're reading, and all this sort of stuff. But it is a nice way to just get good information, you
Yep.
know. And
Yep.
if I'm
Yep.
doing fiction, heck, it's super easy to go on there and say, max speeds of a great white shark, and it tells you everything: hunting speed, normal speed, males versus females, length, sizes, speeds, all the stuff you don't need, but it gives you enough information that you can just say, all right, I've got that for my story. I didn't get that detail wrong. um, I know an author that got chewed out heavily by his followers because he mentioned a safety on a gun, and that particular model didn't have a safety, and his all of his Marine constituents were pissed about it. So you've got somebody constantly checking you out, making sure you get everything right. And so I obsess maybe too much over that. But especially with gospel stuff. So I do find myself you know getting extra stressed about those types of things. But a lot of times just a quick Google search will tell you what confirm what you thought. Even if
Right.
it's just like, when did this guy get baptized, or whatever.
Mm,
um yeah, I know I made a mistake in Apostles on Trial. I mentioned one of the brethren is referred to frequently as an apostle by the early brethren. And I thought he'd been advanced to the 12, and apparently he hadn't. But my source said he had, and I had a couple that said he had, so I put it down there, and I had a couple people get real upset about it.
oh,
So every little detail like that, I might even have a source in a book, but I'll still look and I'll check it on online, make sure, was that date right? You know, was that the married name or the pre-married name, or whatever those details might be. So,
gotcha.
but I don't use it for help writing at all or getting
Just
ideas.
kind of for research more than anything else.
Yeah, especially lately, like most of the stuff I've been doing lately is not so much investigative reporting so much as getting back to the originals and getting rid of all the changes that have been put into the sources that we are most familiar with. So
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, I'm pretty distrustful of it too, but for entirely different reasons. Because at this point, it's kind of starting to make Terminator look like a documentary. And like I I see what it's starting to do, and then Boston Robotics come out with some of their stuff, and I'm like, yeah, it's spooky. We shouldn't
yeah,
we shouldn't
shoot,
do this.
Musk is putting those things out at 10 grand for the base models now. I mean, that's affordable for a lot of families.
Dude, that's less than a car.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I mean, it's not affordable for me. I'm not saying that. I wish it was, but yeah, that's so cheap. I mean, when you think about what it can do and what it's, and so you plug it in and just have it make you breakfast every day. What else can it do? It's pretty amazing for that kind of a price range.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, like, look, I I like humanity. I really do. I like people, right? However, I've seen people do enough stupid stuff that I'm not sure we're ready for robots yet. I just think we need to think this one over. Pump the
Yeah,
brakes.
at least not intelligent ones.
Right, right,
Make them
yeah,
all like C3PO or something, or sorry, R2D2, so they're not, they don't have much to scare you with.
right, right, right. Yeah. No, I'm just like when on the other hand, I'll say this, Drew. I'll get even more nervous when we can figure out, how like now in public restrooms, it's all done by sensor and half the time it doesn't work, right? You wave your hand under there and it never works. So maybe I'm worrying for nothing,
We
right?
must go to the same gym.
Pretty much. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, dude, what are we talking about today?
I was actually thinking about that. I'm like, shoot, we've talked about doing three different podcasts. So
I know. It's funny. There almost seems to be a podcast season. I'll be honest with you. Like once October hits, things get a little sparse. I always have enough to do. But man, come about this time of year, I've noticed it picks up. I don't know if people just start doing
oh,
projects and getting ambitious, but this is about the time of year where I have a lot of people beating down my door.
interesting.
So, and I
I,
can't
I
figure
had
it
no
out.
idea.
Me neither. Me neither. Who knew?
For me,
So,
it's every 3 months or so. It's just
I know. No, well, that's because you put out a book about that often. It's incredible. And I want to make sure that we talk about them because it's all good stuff.
well, it's I've in all honesty, I was really enjoying a lot of the stuff I was doing a lot more than I've enjoyed the last couple projects. But that said, I think my last couple projects are the more important things that I've done. They've just been painfully tedious to perform.
Yeah.
I
Yeah, I can
literally
imagine.
spent and I don't I don't keep super tight track of my time, but I spent roughly 3 months full time just doing punctuation stuff, and I could tell you I lost 5 years of my life to that endeavor because it was so painful. I would almost rather dig ditches all day long than determine if a semicolon versus a colon makes a difference.
Uh,
But sometimes it does, and it's a really interesting thing to think about and wonder if there was any intentionality there or not. You know,
right. I was gonna say that's the whole reason I decided to do a podcast and not a blog. It's because I'm like, I don't have a good enough command of punctuation to even make that work. So good on you. So what do you got?
well, I think the last few projects that I've been working on, and a continual project actually that we were talking about is what we're referring to as the JSV, or Joseph Smith version of scriptures. So should I just kind of give a foundational of what that is and
Yeah,
why
give a
I was
foundational
there?
thing and then we'll dive in.
All right. So I've been wanting to do this for years. And in fact, when I was in the AUB, one of the bishops came to me and said, Drew, um, uh, we're using the church's scriptures, but the scriptures tell us that we're supposed to be putting our tithing money to printing scriptures. So why are we using these scriptures that somebody else put out that pushes their agenda and their stuff when we could have our own versions. And how much has changed anyways? Like, is it a big difference or a little difference or what? He's just kind of talking to me about it. And I said, I'd love to do a project where we had as if a fundamentalist version of the scriptures, and what would that look like and so forth. So we talked quite a bit about it. He asked permission from the council. They basically said, forget it, we're not paying for that sort of thing. So he started buying some books for me through it. I'm oversimplifying that, but he bought some books for me to kind of help me so I could do it sometime. But I said, doing it without funding, I could take 10 years.
Right.
It's a massive project. And I've already been, this over the last couple of years, I've been working on the Joseph Smith the D&C annotated project, and got a couple volumes of that out. But that's a lot of work to do, and without a really good fundraiser, you just can't do it fast.
Right.
I did a fundraiser for the D&C annotated, and it got about roughly 30% of what I needed. And so it took it from being a 10-year project to being a 4-year project or something. Maybe 5, I don't know, hopefully only 4. But that's you can't do something that big without support.
Right.
And so I've kind of had it in my mind that I wanted to do this, and for the following reasons. And I'll give a little bit of my background here as I'm talking about that. I back when I was in college, I took the Joseph Smith translation course from Robert J. Matthews, and interviewed him about it, talked to him about it. I underlined and marked the 3,410 verses that Joseph changed in the Old and New Testaments, and went through that whole project and wanted a complete JST. Wanted to produce one at some point in the future, because not only did he make those changes, but in his discourses he made several more changes. And we have cross references to the D&C and sometimes to the Book of Mormon of some of these scriptures that have alterations or changes that he made somewhere else that you could compare and contrast. So that had been on my mind for a long time. But then I started realizing how many changes had been made to the Doctrine and Covenants.
Mm-hmm.
And as a member of the church at the time, I'm like, well, but yeah, it's just grammatical, doesn't really matter, and who cares? And you just kind of go along with the stream of things, and that's all well and good. But sooner or later, I started finding more and more significant changes that were made, and got interested in it. And also started realizing that there are a lot of unpublished revelations of Joseph Smith.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to remember, don't want to say it wrong. Smoot and Pasentino put out
Okay.
of the uncanonized revelations earlier this year, which was really discouraging for me, because that's part of what the project was about. But at any rate, I started working on the D&C annotated, because I thought that's the most significant. There's some interesting stuff in the Book of Mormon that's been changed. Definitely some interesting stuff in the Pearl of Great Price. A lot of that's been written about, so it's a little bit easier to find. But with the D&C, we've got is it Kurt Bench that put out the parallel version of the three earliest versions of the D&C Book of Commandments. But those are parallel, and if I just want to read scriptures, I'm not going to read a parallel version. If I want to study, I'll do that. But I wanted a version that I could read and study. You know what I mean?
Right.
Why did it have to be separate?
Right.
I want to do them both at the same time. So at any rate, so I started that D&C annotated project, and I love that. I learned so much. I probably learned more from doing D&C 76 annotated than anything I've done my whole life, gospel study wise. And again, when I did 42, learned a massive amount. I was shocked how much I learned. Was really, really enjoying that. And then I had a visitor come over to my house, somebody I'd never really met before. And I'll keep his name quiet for now, because I don't know if he'd like the airtime or whatever. But anyway, he just came over to my house. He said, "I've heard about you. I've got this thing that I've been interested in doing, and I want to know if you'd be interested. And so we talked for a number of hours, and he said, I would like to get a pure version of the scriptures out. And by pure version, what he meant, I'm simplifying this a little bit now,
Sure.
but by pure version, what he meant was, let's get a version that was approved by Joseph Smith, um, that has modern versification and is clean, clean of errors and that sort of stuff. And I had some disagreements with him on some details, and his partner, who was willing to fund this a little bit. And I say a little bit, I'm not trying to undermine what they did, but they weren't able to fund it as much as they were hoping, and as much as I needed to do it full time. So it's taken extra time to get it done. But whenever we talked about these things, I said, look, I ended up just kind of educating the parties involved about some of the things that were going on in the scriptures. I was kind of surprised a couple of them didn't know. But I realized, wow, there's a whole lot of even misunderstanding among fundamentalists as to what Joseph actually did in producing the Book of Mormon, or what he did in producing the Doctrine and Covenants.
Explain that real quick.
Okay, great. So, for example, a lot of people are like, well, Joseph did the paragraphs, right? So we can't get rid of the paragraphs. No, he didn't. He had nothing to do with the paragraphs. The paragraphs in the Book of Mormon were done by the printer, and he made the decision as where to start a new paragraph based upon when "and it came to pass" showed up.
Okay.
And I don't know how many people are remotely aware. I wasn't. But as I recall, there are 2,319 entries of "and it came to pass," or versions of it somewhere in the Book of Mormon. So that's how many paragraphs you have. Inspired, right?
Interesting.
Can't change that. Joseph did it. So that's just not true. Personally, I like reading the paragraph format, and so did everybody else on the committee. But then you don't have the verses.
It doesn't lend well to study, right? You can't
Right.
reference things quickly, and
Yeah. So if I'm reading, for instance, this book here by Pasantino and Smoot. Sorry, do it backwards. If I'm referencing that book and it's talking about the Book of Mormon, I'm not going to find it in a lithographic reprint because it
right.
doesn't have verses. So we wanted to put those in. So I said, let's just follow the Christians. Example on this, I put small grayish foot or the verses, so you can still find them, but they're not intrusive. So we decided to do that. But the next thing is, okay, so Joseph, he Joseph did punctuation, right?
Right.
And the answer is wrong. In the Book of Mormon, we have some of his handwriting here and there, but not very much. I mean, he had scribes do almost the entire thing.
Right.
And the printer's manuscript was entirely copied. I should say entirely. Somebody who knows the study might be get me on a detail like this, but it was pretty much done by Oliver Cowdery. He might have had a little bit of help, and he made 2 to 3 errors per page. And that's coming from pardon me getting up here, but I think it's worth it. This book by Skousen, not Cleon Skousen, but I think it's probably his son or
Royal. Yep.
Royal Skousen. He puts a lot of facts and a lot of research into the original manuscript, trying to recreate it, which is great. It did really great scholarship. It's about 30 years of his life's work too. So, guy deserves a medal for spending that much time in the Book of Mormon. But it doesn't really match what I'm trying to do or what I'm interested in. But it was a great resource to look at. But he does paragraphing based on just looking at the content, like you would as if you were the author. And looking at his work, he did a pretty good job. I was mostly impressed with how he did it. So for our Book of Mormon, we followed his paragraphing mostly.
Okay.
There were some exceptions, and he doesn't do anything with dialogue. As an author, I see, one of the Antichrist talking to the prophet goes back and forth, back and forth. I want to see a paragraph break,
Right.
I want to be able to say, where's that conversation, and look and find the conversation. So that was one thing that we changed. And there are several dialogues, a lot more than I thought, but, now that I've gone through it, seems obvious, but, we've got dialogue between Nephi and the servant of Laban. We've got Nephi and his brothers, and Nephi and his father. We've got dialogue between the three antichrists and whoever they're with, and dialogue between Moroni and the people that he's scalping and that sort of stuff. So, there's several different versions of dialogue in there. Of course, Christ, when he comes to visit, is mostly a monologue, so we don't get that so much as a dialogue, but still separated things like that. But I was surprised how many people I had to, when talking about it, that didn't know the paragraphing wasn't done by Joseph, didn't know punctuation wasn't done by Joseph. And further, the punctuation provided a bigger problem, and that's this: the people involved didn't know what they were doing. The Book of Mormon wasn't awful, and I say that kind of tenderly. It wasn't awful. It wasn't good either. But at least it was fairly consistent. It was mostly one guy whose idea of whatever 19th century punctuation was supposed to be, what it's supposed to look like, and he was fairly consistent. Not really, but pretty consistent. For the most part, he was pretty consistent. So going through and doing punctuation on that was a lot easier than the D&C, where the D&C punctuation was done by a committee of about 5 different men, and they all did different stuff. And we don't know, for instance, what did a semicolon mean to them back then? I mean, they used it a lot. What did a colon mean to them? They used it a lot. They used it like a period. We don't really use it like a period now. We try to not use it at all. But it's got like 5 or 6 or 7 different possibilities of what it's used for, depending on how pedantic you want to be about separating ideas and thoughts and so forth. And we don't know what they thought about it because it wasn't standardized.
Right.
A period is standard, but they didn't use a period very often, frankly. They used semicolon and comma more than they used a period. So when going through the punctuation, I ran into it was just the D&C punctuation was just awful. I mean, just to be blunt, it's bad enough that the grammar is rough. It's bad enough that the Old English is wrong and incorrect in several instances. It's bad enough that you're jumping with verses that are separating things in odd places from time to time. But put that all together, and then have a committee of 5 totally different people doing the editing on it, and it really becomes quite a problem.
So those 5 guys, was that while Joseph was alive or after he
yes,
passed?
yeah,
Okay.
Joseph appointed a committee, and it's talked about a little bit in the Doctrine and Covenants itself, but they appointed a committee to go through and revise the scripture. D&C 57 commands him to revise the scriptures and prepare them for publication. In a private letter to W.W. Phelps, who was one of the people, he wrote and said, I want you to revise it and change stuff, but don't change the sense of it. Don't change the meaning. And then he kind of alludes to the curses in the Old Testament or, other places. He says, the curses are those who change scriptures, right?
Right.
So he clearly didn't see grammar as changing it. It just, and even adding something to clarify it wasn't changing it to him.
Sure.
Only if you change the sense, which that's a whole rabbit hole.
Oh yeah. Well, that's kind of a broad, that gives somebody a lot of room to do stuff, right?
It does.
Some
Yeah.
good and
they
some
did.
bad, I would imagine.
Huh?
Some good and some bad, I would imagine.
Yeah. And I found a lot of things there where, and we're kind of veering off a little bit, but I think it's helpful to create this foundation. For instance, there are places, Joseph Smith, this isn't super well known. I think I mentioned it in a previous podcast with you, but Joseph Smith was kind of, as he was revising the Book of Mormon, he was revising stuff in the D&C, he was getting rid of clunky, hard to read sentences and replacing them with stuff that's easier to understand.
Okay.
And, the committee was doing the same thing. So sometimes I might say Joseph did D&C, but we really don't know if it was Joseph or the committee. But there was a pattern that he was trying to make them easier to read and easier to understand. And he was also getting rid of a lot of Old English. He got rid of, I think, 43 versions of "And It Came to Pass," and deleted them out of his 1840 edition of the Book of Mormon. So so you've got all these intentions, but you've got different people doing them. So you might have one person, for instance, in the committee who's from England and who will remain nameless. Maybe there were two of them, but they want to correct spelling so that it matches British spelling. So Savior is Saviour, and
Yeah.
favor is Favour and stuff like that. And so they're changing the original manuscripts to have this English spelling for British English. And then somebody else is seeing British English in a previous, Book of Commandments or something, and they're taking it out and making an American English spelling. You've got people literally, there are places where they had a comma, they changed it to a semicolon, it gets reprinted in another edition, gets changed back to a comma, and then it gets to 1835 edition is printed, and now they put a period there, and then 1837 comes along, they put a semicolon there. It's just back and forth, and we don't know what they were thinking. It's not like they're editing and saying,
Right.
oh well, I think these sentences are related, they need a semicolon. Or if they're like, well, I don't really think this is a complete sentence, even though it might be, because of some technical reason that was different back then. And so I put a semicolon here because it's not really period. We just don't know what they were doing. And so as I went through it, the Doctrine and Covenants took me twice as long as the entire Book of Mormon, which is longer, because they were inconsistent. They each did it their own different way. And so I get used to a section of the Doctrine and Covenants and be like, oh, okay, zip through that one. And the next one, I'd be looking at it and thinking, okay, does that colon change the meaning?
Right.
And almost never does it change the meaning. But one of the uses of a colon is to say the second clause or the second part of the sentence, depending on how you want to call it, is clarifying the first.
Mm.
That's kind of like a semicolon, except for it's not saying they're just related. It's saying the second one clarifies the first. And so sometimes I'd look at it and I'm like, well, it doesn't clarify at all. It can't be the use, period's good there. Or maybe I should consider a semicolon there, but you have to kind of think through these things. But I did leave several, probably, I don't know, 15, 20 of them in the DNC because I couldn't decide. I don't know if that's what they were using the semicolon for. And if
Right.
they're trying to say the second clarifies the first, and I can read it that way, then I would leave it that way. However, sometimes that changes the meaning. And
Right.
then I would drop a footnote and say, the original has a colon, so I left it. It might have been a printer. It might have been somebody who was really sleepy and didn't know what a colon was for. It might just mean, I think there needs to be a break here. That's what a colon's for, right? I don't know. I think so. So that's what they did. We really don't know what it was for. But on the off chance that they knew what they were doing and they did it for that purpose, I left it there. And then I footnoted and said, if I change this to semicolon, this can change the meaning. Here's why. If I change it to a period, it changes the meaning. Here's why. So the reader can decide, what's correct doctrine. Let me give you an example of this. Oh, shoot. I had it up, but I had to relaunch my computer to get on Zoom. There's an interesting, common, or well-known scripture, I should say, the Book of Mormon that does this. And I'm pulling it up as we speak, but it'll take me just a minute here.
No, you're good. This will give me a chance to ask a few questions here.
Okay.
So, one, kind of good on you for leaving, giving an explanation on why, what you found, right? In surveying, a lot of times the field work we do is all about collecting evidence, right?
Yeah.
Monuments, those sorts of things. And I worked with a guy who was really good. And he used to say, no one can ever call you a liar by showing what you found.
Right.
And
Yes.
and that is, I think, a really important principle here that it sounds like
Yeah.
you've incorporated into this. Now, my next question is, there was no help at all. There was nothing that you could go back to, an equivalent of Webster's 1820 or something like that, where you could say, okay, for the most part, it meant this punctuation meant this in this scenario.
Yeah. So I can do that, but it gets really speculative. And
Okay.
it's a bit problematic because, first of all, the Book of Mormon was transcribed before 1828, at
Right.
least in large part. I actually don't know the date that it was totally finished. I should have that memorized, but I don't. Um, So, but but then you've got, well, that's kind of representing maybe a couple decades or not. But the 1828 dictionary was also kind of the pioneer of codifying things.
Okay.
And so the question is, because it was kind of a pioneering work and it was brand new to those brethren, did they consult it at all? We have no knowledge that they consulted those at all. Did they have the same ideas? Well, certainly the guys from England probably didn't. Um, well, maybe that's not fair to it. It doesn't seem that they would be as likely to be as familiar with it as an American would be. And on the other hand, as it appears to be kind of an effort to codify things, was it well received? Was it something that, yeah, that's exactly what we use it for? Or was it more like, well, that's not how we do it? We guys from New England, we do it differently. And the guys from, southern United States do it differently. And you guys are trying to push your northerner perspective on us, and we don't like it. Um,
Mm,
I don't know how much of that was playing. And that's probably a very niche book that I've never run across, seen, or found.
right.
Is how it was received. So I think that it requires an awful lot of speculation, even looking at that. I think the best we can really do is say, we've got 20 rules for a semicolon. For example, I'm just throwing a number out. It's not going to be 20. That's too
Sure.
high. But it's not like there are three, right?
Right.
And the chances are, of those 8 rules or 10 rules or 20 rules, whatever that is, that incorporates the three that they were using back then too. But which
Okay.
ones were they not using? We just we don't know, because they didn't say we didn't do this. And the only hints that we have of a codified version of it come from a single source that may not have represented what those people were thinking at the time. So it really is left to speculation. It's like the spelling. If anything, they didn't seem to have any indicia of some sort of codified spelling in the Doctrine and Covenants or in the Book of Mormon. Um, the Book of Mormon's better because it went through a printer and he edited it and got it pretty standardized. But there's still some things in there that we wouldn't let float today for spelling wise. Um, so at any rate, those leave some challenging holes in our game that we can't. Um, we know a period means the end of a sentence to us. It
Hmm.
probably did to them because they didn't use it that much, and every time they did, that's what it meant. But when it comes to a semicolon, man, they're just not consistent. I'm like, why isn't there a period here? There's no reason there can't be a period here. And it's, are you trying to say these two sentences are related? Because this one starts out with therefore, so it kind of tells you it's related just by the word there. You don't need
Right.
a semicolon. The period should be good. Um, but second guessing that becomes interpretive as well. And so it took me so long to go through it, partially because, and I can't say this happened every single sentence, but partially because I would stop and I would say, wait, um, what's the best punctuation here? I think the cleanest is to use a period. They used a semicolon. Is there any reason that semicolon changes the meaning? And if it does, I leave it.
Gotcha.
If
Okay.
it's insignificant and minor and only an academic's going to ever notice it, then I leave it and I don't footnote it.
Gotcha.
There are plenty of those because a semicolon functions kind of like a period for most
Right.
people, and they're just not really going to notice. Um, but there are some that did make a difference. I want to share that one with you I mentioned earlier, and that
Yeah.
was kind of a good time. This is in Second Nephi 2, where he says, Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy. Okay. We've all heard that. We're familiar with it. It used a colon there. Adam fell that men might be, colon, and men are that they might have joy. Okay. Now, if they had intention behind that, it's one of the possibilities is they're trying to say men are that they might have joy modifies and clarifies Adam fell that men might be. So you say, okay, well, that's simple enough. That's kind of the point of the verse, and we get it. However, one possible reading, let me emphasize that. You don't have to read it that way. One possible reading of this punctuation is that joy comes after this life as a result of the final redemption from the fall. The semicolon here would simply suggest we exist to have joy. That's how everybody interprets it, or at least everybody that I know interprets it. And the colon can be read to have that implication as well, but you could read it to say, I think that reason they put a colon there is they're trying to say men are that they might have joy in the afterlife, because that's why he fell. So that after the redemption, we'll have joy. Well, you know, that's a massive theological change in
Mm-hmm.
understanding. One is, and I've heard this a lot among fundamentalists, well, I'm just supposed to suffer my whole life so that eventually I'll be happy in heaven, right? And we've
Yeah.
got some doctrines that teach that suffering is good for us and we need to endure it well, and it's part of our testing, and that's what God wants us to do. But there's this ballooning ideology around that life is supposed to suck. We're supposed to be miserable, and part of being miserable is with the promise that it won't last forever. We'll be happy later. And that interpretation is rampant with that semicolon or with that colon.
Right.
You can read that more clearly, and again, you don't have to, but you can read it more clearly. Whereas if I put a semicolon there, it's not there. It's not there at all. And and the semicolon says we're supposed to have joy here, right? And
Right.
that's kind of the mainstream LDS perspective is we're supposed to have joy here, right? So to heck with all these hard doctrines we don't want to live. We're not gonna accept some of these early doctrines because they don't bring joy, right? Plural marriage is the chief offender there, where they talk about that. So that supports that reading, which makes it controversial. So I don't read it the first way. I don't. I think suffering is part of our life experience. That's part of what we need to do to grow. That's part of what matures you and makes you ready to become ready for exaltation. All those types of things. I don't think we're supposed to be miserable every day of our lives here, and then all of a sudden we'll magically be happy there. We're
Right.
we're, we're going to have the same disposition there as here. So I don't personally believe that, but I footnoted it there, and it's a lengthy footnote because it can be read that way, and I think it's significant that it's read that could be read that way, and people should be able to look at it and see why is that semicolon there, or
Right.
why is that colon there? Why not a period? What does that mean? And for somebody who's not educated in academia, that might be a rough read for them. And even if not, I think it's important to look and say, I left this punctuation here, even though it's awkward. I left it there because it can be interpreted in this way. I don't personally believe it. I don't say that in the footnote.
Right.
I don't personally believe that, but I'm not going to leave it out because like you're saying earlier, nobody's going to call you a liar if you expose all the evidence. But I just think it's important to read things, even if you disagree with them, to see it's there.
Right. Right.
It's possible to read it that way. So if I find somebody who believes that, I don't think, oh, you're just a moron.
Right.
Where you come up with that stupid idea? You can have your mind open and say, oh, yeah, I disagree, but I know where you're coming from. I get it. And Joseph left this mess for us here. And one of us is right, one's wrong, but we both acknowledge and agree at least that we have a reasonable reason for disagreement.
Sure.
So, and
Well,
there are a
oh,
couple
sorry.
dozen
Go
of
ahead.
those. Sorry, yeah, there are very few of those in the Book of Mormon. Probably a dozen in the Doctrine and Covenants, and I don't always footnote them because they're uh, less significant, right?
Gotcha.
But I do note them from time to time because I think they're super, super important. We've got the DNC 89 comma that messes up the word of wisdom. And we've got similar, problems in other scriptures. I don't think there are any famous ones in the Book of Mormon, but that one kind of struck me as one that's very significant, even, like I said, even though I don't agree with it.
Did when you were putting this together, was there anything that would have been like commentary contemporary to the time that they were doing it that would have given you like a tip or a tell, so to speak, right? So,
Right.
you know, do you find anything in journals where people are expounding on a certain verse in the Book of Mormon or the Revelations that would kind
Right.
of tip their hand to be like, okay, this is how it was understood in this day, right? And
Right.
did that ever factor into any of this?
I would love to say it did. It did not. I didn't go into the journals much and do that. I did a little bit of diving, but not much. And I am intending and so let me kind of backtrack a little bit. I've had two brethren help fund some of this research.
Hmm.
And anything I put under the name JSV in my publications is is under that umbrella. And
Okay,
ultimately, they will be publishing a nice gold gilded edges, leather bound, or something similar to that through Pioneer Press with Kevin Kraut, a version of these scriptures for the JSV.
gotcha.
Um, so the hope is that we will, and their finances will blossom or something. I don't know exactly what all the hopes are, but the hope is I'll later do an academic study version of all of these. Which
Mm,
case I'll be going through all the different commentaries I can find on the Doctrine and Covenants and on the Book of Mormon and do an annotated version of all of those, which I'm already doing for the DNC. So there's a lot of crossover there. And for those who are following my DNC annotated project, I've mentioned this as I'm sending out notifications and stuff, but not everybody reads those because maybe they're less excited about them. But this whole JSV version of the DNC is the foundation of my future annotated project. So it gave me a big boost to move forward on that. Although I will have to make some changes for some details. But that said, um, oh shoot, I've got so many thoughts. I'm sorry, just one like circle. I'm like,
no, you're
it
good.
um, so delving into the journals and all that sort of stuff for some of those indications. No, I didn't do that study version. We'll see. That said, the Joseph Smith Papers Project, which is something that I refer to frequently, it's such a wonderful resource. If I wish I could talk to somebody who's in charge of the website and help them reorganize it so it's useful outside of whatever mentality they've got to for the average person to find what you're looking for easily would they could make some massive changes that would make me really happy. But anyway, I used that. I love that, and I did find some stuff about some of the historical background. There's a couple of really good articles they had, both on the DNC and Book of Mormon, that talked about who was doing what and how things happened and that sort of stuff. And there's nothing there that really kind of addresses what you're getting at. Um, I could point out one item of interest that sort of addresses that, and maybe something you're searching for or not. I'm not sure, so I'll just tell you. So, um, Joseph went to Oliver Cowdery and said, "Hey, I want you to get the baptismal ordinance, the sacrament ordinance, put it in the Doctrine and Covenants." So, I haven't looked at those entries and that stuff a while. It was brought up a number of times in priest quorum in Missouri a few years ago when I was there. Um, but at any rate, there's some church history footnotes and stuff that talk a little bit about this. But anyway, so that's what was done. So part of the discussion we had in Missouri was we were saying, well, but the DNC baptism word verbiage is different than the Book of Mormon verbiage. So, Joseph said, go copy it, but he didn't copy it. But actually, the original manuscript shows that it was the same originally. And I can't remember
Interesting.
when. I think it was in the 1835 version that Oliver Cowdery changed it to read how it reads now, but the original was directly from the Book of Mormon.
Interesting.
So,
So the prayers matched in the DNC and the Book of Mormon at one point.
right. Originally they did, but now
Interesting.
they don't. So, and that's a really, really interesting question because, for those I did a whole book, Changing Ordinances, Changing Priesthood, where I talk about this a little bit. But, we've got some of us that are very, very dogmatic. You cannot change the ordinance. Is that not changing it to change the verbiage like that? And one answer is apparently Oliver Cowdery thought it means the same things, it's just easier to say, or he liked the verbiage or something. I don't know. We have no indication Joseph told him to change it to read like that, which is also a possibility, just not in the record. But at any rate, it is different, but does it make a difference? And because we know the early brethren used the sacrament prayer as a template and did not read it word for word, it's possible they did the same thing with the baptismal covenant. And maybe Cowdery, when he was revising, just thought, oh, this sounds better, so I'll just say it like this. When we don't know, we've got a little bit in the historical record to guide us a tiny bit, but not tons. And that said, I want to make clear, I haven't dug deeply into that rabbit hole. That's not something I've done an annotated version on. It's not something that necessitated me footnoting this long church history thing that was outside of the scope of the JSV that I was doing for that section. When I do an annotated version of that section, I'll look into it more deeply. So there may be somebody out there that wrote the article in 1980 that's like, ooh, me. I know exactly what happened here.
Right.
So, let me know. I'd love to know. I'll put it in my annotated version, but I'm just disclosing I haven't personally dug that deeply into it, but it does address kind of what you're talking about, that does play a difference there.
The difference from the Book of Mormon to the Doctrine and Covenants, I guess, never concerned me a whole bunch. And maybe I'm wrong in the way I got there, right? And it was, well, the Book of Mormon is largely narrative in nature, right? It's telling a story. The Doctrine and Covenants is something that's unique, certainly in Christendom, maybe in all of religion, in that it's more of a how-to guide, right? You get the sense
Yeah.
that Joseph's trying to learn how to make this whole restored church thing work, right? And so
Yeah.
he's going to God and saying, "Hey, how do I do this?" And so I would expect that as far as functionality, like, okay, how do I give a blessing, or how do I do the sacrament, or the baptism, or whatever. The Doctrine and Covenants, and again, this is just how my brain worked on it. I was always like, well, the Doctrine and Covenants would probably be what you'd want to go with there because it's not a narrative. This is
Mhm.
instruction based. Does that make sense? And am I off base with
It
some of
makes
that?
sense. I know a lot of people would disagree with you, and I'm kind of in between somewhere on this issue. But Jesus does say this is how you should do it, and
Right.
he
Well,
said,
that's a good point too. Yes.
but the verbiage does or could be read to signify a very large difference. Jesus is speaking to the 12 in person and says, "Thus shall you baptize, having authority given me of Christ." Right?
Right.
Or it's he just gave him authority, so that's what you're saying. Whereas for the rest of us, when you're ordained a priest, you might be 10, 13, 20, 50 generations of priesthood lineage back to Christ, back to
Right.
Joseph Christ or something. So being commissioned means it's not directly given authority.
Okay.
That could, so I've wondered, is that what Oliver Cowdery was trying to say? Until you've had the Savior lay his hands on your head, you say this way. But if he
I
has laid his
see.
hands on your head, or if he gives it to you in person, like he did to the 12 in the third Nephi, then you say, having authority given me of Jesus Christ.
Interesting.
Um, I'm not saying that's correct. I'm just saying that's something I've thought about, pondered over, and been like, what's the proper way to, does it matter? Are we
Right.
straining that? Are we overshooting the target? Or is there something here? And so I know that that's a big issue. The other thing is in the Book of Mormon, he says, "After this manner shall you administer the sacrament," and it tells them specifically how to do it. And some people reading that say there should only be one person administering the sacrament. Some people reading it say you're supposed to take the cup in your hand and hold it when you do the wine. Some say, you break the bread before you bless it in the Book of Mormon. And since that's not how it's done, in the New Testament Gospels, you have him doing both ways: bless them, break, and break them, bless. But the Book of Mormon says this is how you're supposed to do it. He breaks, then he blesses. So some people take that as a very strong, beyond narrative This is the instruction how to do it, and quit fighting about it. Right? It says there shall be no more contentions among you about how to do this. That's also
Right.
instruction. So, so some people read the Book of Mormon account is more significant than the D&C for that reason. And at any rate, so I think it's important to be aware of both
Ooh.
sides. And for me, I honestly think that the intention behind it is 100 times more important than some of the details. Because in some of those instances, I think he's giving us a template and not a rigid word for word how to do it. I don't know that that's always the case, and even with that belief, every Sunday when I do sacrament with my family, I do it word for word.
Right.
that so I'm part of that's talking theory more than it is talking reality. But as I've explained to my kids, if it's okay, like Brigham Young in his generation, they read the sacrament totally different all the time, and if that's okay, that's fine. But if I don't want to be the one that someday in heaven some guy comes over to my house, I do that, and he remembers and he does it, and he changes stuff, and he causes a bunch of trouble later. It's like, well, I got the idea from Drew.
Right.
you know, I don't want that on my shoulders. So, so I'm like, I'll be rigid on this, but as I'm being rigid, I understand the the purpose behind this, and I teach that to my kids too, because I don't want them getting caught up in traditions. You know,
Right.
we do too many things by tradition, and we don't even know why. We're just like, well, Grandpa always did it that way. Isn't that how you're supposed to do it? You know, I went to a Sunday school recently, and it was one of the best Sunday schools I've ever been to. I really, really enjoyed it. But when they sang, um, after every phrase, they added a beat, and at the end of each chorus, the full, um, the finish the song, they added two beats, and then they would start the song again.
Wow.
and and that's no harm, no foul. I mean,
Right.
there's nothing wrong with that. But I was starting to sing in each of those holes, and I'm like, oh, oh, oh,
Back up.
do not do that. You're going to sound really bad in front of, this whole congregation is going to be like, what's his problem? He keeps belting out for no reason. um, and I give that as an example because it's completely innocuous. It doesn't matter at all. None of that's ever going to affect anybody's salvation. But we do that sort of stuff a lot, and we don't notice. And that was
Right.
my whole point. They don't notice that. They're not doing that on purpose. That's just some tradition that evolved because they don't have a lot of musicians in their family. And I'm presuming because uh, I've got a degree in music, and that would have driven me crazy 30 years ago. you know, um, but it just evolved because people were shy in the family, or they didn't want to start singing first, and so these spaces just got longer and longer or something. I don't know,
Right.
but the point is, we develop traditions without noticing it and without really understanding what we're doing. And I think it's important to see those distinctions and be careful about them regularly. So when I teach my kids, I do those types of things. I explicitly remind them of things like that a lot for that very reason. Um, but yeah, anyway, there's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, that's okay. And then so the format of these, because I know the LDS Church did some work in cross indexing and those sorts of things. Will that have some of that in there as well?
Okay, so the the raw version has no cross references. What it does have are annotations that I inserted, and there are a few different reasons. So I'll explain that briefly, and then I'll say why. If I forget that, let me know. So in the Doctrine and Covenants, I footnote anything that was later changed from the original. So I say the original read like this, and it was changed, and this is what it was in 1844 when Joseph died. Presumably, Joseph approved of all the changes made in 1844. Yes, it was published after he died. The vast majority of it was done before he died. and not much was changed after he died, as far as we could tell. Um, but the kind of broad assumption that I made was either Joseph, delegatory wise, authorized people to make changes, or he micromanaged. There's almost zero evidence that he micromanaged. It looks like he pretty much gave it to the committee and forgot about it for a couple of years. He talked to him about it here and there. Um, it's hard for me to imagine the prophet doing that. I know he's super busy, and there were all sorts of complications and problems for him doing that project. So I assume it's somewhere in the middle, and we just don't have a historical record that gives us a good, solid understanding of what that was. But regardless, I look at it and assume Joseph probably approved this change. It was 1840. But if something is significant and changes doctrine or changes how you understand how to do a blessing or whatever, if there's any substantive change at all, I footnote it so you can see the original and what it was changed to. And some of those, and there are hundreds of those. It's not, I was really surprised because everybody says, oh, the changes are all grammatical. They don't really matter. It's spelling changes and stuff. Very few real changes. That's complete BS. And it's not true.
Mm.
I have hundreds of changes, and every one of them I consider substantive, meaning it's important to somebody. As the change I mentioned earlier with the colon, with men are that they might have joy, that scripture, that is something that is substantive. It makes a difference to somebody. Somebody's going to read that and say, see, I told you this is life is all about suffering. And maybe I shouldn't pander to that particular one. I don't know. I should be ashamed of myself, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Somebody somewhere will find meaning in there. And it's not my business to deny them of that reading. That's personal to them. And I'm not going to be responsible for not disclosing that. So anytime there was a change that I thought a reasonable person could see a difference here and change how they understand this passage, I footnoted it. And some of those are minor, that honest, they're minor. Some of them are gigantic, they're really, really big.
Which ones were gigantic? I'm curious, right? Like,
yeah. So D&C 42, my annotated version, I talked to you about this when we did D&C 42. Yep. There's whole verses added. And several times there are phrases that are very lengthy that are added. And in those changes, most of them are saying, okay, this was an early chapter in the Doctrine and Covenants, early section. And now we've received a lot more light knowledge, and we've added the high priest quorum, and we've changed the structure of how the high council works, and all these types of things. And so retroactively, they insert those new revelations into the old revelation. So instead of it saying, go and get 2 elders to adjudicate this, they say, go get the high council to adjudicate it, or something like that.
I see.
Those are very big differences.
Right.
And there are lots of those that dramatically changes what you do, right?
Yeah.
You and I get in a fight and we disagree about something, we're pissed off about it, we want to kick each other out of the church. Who do we go to? We go to 2 elders, or do we go to high council?
I see.
If I say 2 elders, you're like, no, scripture says high council. Now what are we going to do? Because now we've got other people have to agree on that too. I mean, that can change everything. And significantly, with administrative things, one of the more important things I think is when Joseph asked if somebody in the first presidency is going to be tried, does D&C 107 still apply? And in one of his unpublished revelations, it says, no, that was when the church was baby, but now that it's bigger, that doesn't make any sense to do it at all. That's not the proper way to try a member of the first presidency. And so, some of these administrative changes we could say are insignificant, but they dramatically impact how people behave in a community of believers. So I footnote every single one of those. I italicize in the Doctrine and Covenants every word that's changed, including if it's a single letter. If a plural is changed singular, vice versa, that's footnoted. That's a change. And if it could be important, if
Right.
it's obviously a typo, I don't do it. If it says Joseph and then the revision says Joseph Smith Jr. and the next revision says Joseph Smith um, without the junior, and then it's reverted to again to say Joseph Smith Jr., I don't mark any of those. Nobody cares. It doesn't change anything. We know what he meant. We know what was going on here. If it says Oliver changes to Oliver Cowdery, I don't footnote those things. That's not substantive change. That's something that you and I know why they did it, right? When,
Right.
when the Lord's speaking, he says Oliver, Joseph Smith's thinking that guy sitting right there. But when they publish it 20 years later, somebody's like, who's Oliver? Is that the guy that was excommunicated or somebody else? Is there other
Gotcha.
multiple Olivers? So no, it was Oliver Cowdery. So there's no change there. So I ignore things like that. Um, but to see what those changes are, it's readily available in the JSV version because I italicize all of those changes and I footnote them. And when I do the annotated version, it will have all of those same changes made and acknowledged. To the main text itself, probably the only change I'll make for the annotated versions is I got rid of unorthodox capitalization in the JSV. But I do include it and will include it in my annotated version because I think there's strong historical evidence that at least a significant part of the time, by the time they use that as emphasis, and they're trying to draw attention to that word, and that changes the meaning sometimes.
Gotcha.
I'll give you an example of that. In Doctrine and Covenants 76, it talks about becoming gods and so forth. In some of those instances, it's capitalized in the original, and some it's not.
Hmm.
And that appears to be referring to somebody who's exalted versus somebody who's maybe had their second anointings but isn't exalted or something like that. I don't have any specific instances in the top of my head, but I know that there's some discrepancies that are like that. And that's the type of thing that could be interpreted to make a difference if it does or not, or if it was intended or not. But that's a little bit more problematic to do in a version that you're trying to produce for kids
Sure.
to so forth. It starts making it look a little bit more messy and more academic. So opted not to include that for the JSV, but I do put it in my kind of big boy version.
Gotcha. And then, another, and I'm sorry, I'm just peppering you with questions here, but
Oh no, that's what I'm here for.
so in this version, going back, Joseph was editing this stuff all the way through, right? As as he's doing this, and you alluded to this, Joseph didn't strike me as a micromanager. He wasn't someone who just left things alone necessarily, but he wasn't a micromanager. And so, with some of these revisions, how do you know that it was actually Joseph Smith approved versus Joseph just never had a chance to look at it, right? That
Right.
to me, because
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to call it the JSV, the Joseph Smith version, I assume is what it stands
Yeah.
for.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know you can attribute that to Joseph Smith?
Right. Okay. Great question. I should have brought that up earlier. Excuse me. Um, so we don't know. We honestly don't know from phrase to phrase to section. We don't know. We don't have any record of Oliver Cowdery sitting down with Joseph and saying, "Okay, these are the changes I made to DNC 76 and the changes I made to DNC 84. Do you approve of all of these?" No such record exists at all. Period. Further, if I'm recalling correctly, we have less than two sentences in Joseph Smith's handwriting in the DNC of any edits or anything being made. So there could be a strong argument that, in fact, Joseph didn't approve anything that I've italicized and footnoted in the JSV. And if that's the case, then we need a whole new version. And it's very problematic because everything after the original Book of Commandments was edited by somebody.
Hmm.
There were complaints against Oliver Cowdery that he changed too much. And I believe he complained somebody else did the same thing before. Um, and we've got this statement from Joseph delegating to W. Phelps saying, "Don't change the sense of it." And we've got at the beginning it says revised and carefully selected by Joseph Smith Jr. Did he say that? Did he agree to that statement? Did he notice that before it was published? We
Right.
we don't know for sure. It's not there. So I do mention in my introduction of the JSV, especially more specifically, should say, and this only really matters in the Doctrine and Covenants. We don't know for absolute positive, but we've got at least D&C 57 commanding him to change the scriptures. We've got him talking to W.W. Phelps. We know Oliver Cowdery was in charge of the changes and made the most. And Joseph Smith Papers Project is a little historical background on this that was really interesting. I didn't put in the introduction, it's just kind of in the back of my head, but where they basically say this whole manuscript that was, of the original stuff that I poured through doesn't appear to have any changes other than what Oliver Cowdery made himself. So there's no reason to believe, if I'm recalling these details correctly, that Joseph ever saw those.
Mm.
Presumably he did, but maybe he didn't. We don't know for positive. That said, I can't imagine those brethren taking it upon themselves to just wholesale rewrite everything, not get Joseph's approval, and then publish it, and then not get in trouble for it. I mean, there was an 1835 version, there was an 1837 version. Surely he saw some of those changes and reviewed some of those changes. And in fact, we do have things that change back and forth a couple times. So it seems very likely to me that he was involved. Did he read every word, every detail, or not? That we just can't be certain. And there we are. That's the problem. That's not true of the Book of Mormon. And there are different types of footnotes for changes in the Book of Mormon than I put in the D&C, and I think that would probably be of interest to a number of the podcast listeners. So this isn't super well known. I believe it's mentioned here, and so if I'm looking down for those who are watching the video, I'm trying to see. I believe there's a chart in Skousen's 1830 Book of Mormon that he did, trying to get back to the very original text. Which, again, as much as I appreciate what he did, I don't care about the original text so much as what Joseph approved later. Brigham Young said if Joseph would have translated the Book of Mormon 50 times or 500 times, it was all different. It wouldn't matter to him. All that revelation is based upon specific experiences that the saints needed and what they were ready to receive. And so if I accept Joseph as a prophet, I also accept, at the day of his death, I should say, right?
Right.
If I accept him then I accept that he made these changes on his own accord. Shoot, I swear he had a chart somewhere. Maybe it's in the appendices. Yeah, here it is. Okay. He calls it stemma for the printed editions. So for those of you looking, this is Book of Mormon, the earliest text by Royal Skousen. And in one of his appendices, if we can get this backwards here, he has this graph showing the branches of the different printings of the Book of Mormon. And looking at that graph, you can see that at different years, there were different publications, and different publications used different versions of the earlier Book of Mormon. So if you try to go look at the bottom of this on the right hand of the stemma, it's the LDS textual tradition. It goes all the way back to the 1837 version. So the church, members of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, do not have the thousands of changes he made in the 1840 version in their lineage here. Now, has somebody gone back and looked at it and traded with it and incorporated some of those? Sure. Is that a 4-volume book on what happened and how much they put in and didn't put in? Has anybody looked at the 1840 version and compared it to the 1981 version or whatever they have now, 2012 or something, and marked all the substantive changes that came from the 1840 that weren't there earlier? I don't know. I don't really care.
Right.
But from what I can see from this, they're missing a lot of those changes. And as I'm going through and doing my own personal studies, I see stuff that looks like it's very different from time to time. Why does it matter? Well, the RLDS used the 1840 version.
Mm,
um, so they have a different textual tradition. Well, Joseph made thousands of changes to the 1840 Book of Mormon, and a lot of those were trying to simplify the readings and get rid of Old English. That's also what I mentioned earlier. He got rid of 43 versions of "and it came to pass."
interesting.
So I have two different kinds of footnotes in the Book of Mormon that I don't have in the Doctrine and Covenants. One version of that is in 1837, Joseph revised and changed the text to read XYZ. And he did. He did those personally, he personally changed stuff. But in 1840, in 1837, he used the printer's manuscript, which was Oliver Cowdery's copied version, which included 2 to 3 errors a page, according to Royal Skousen's counting of those mistakes he made copying.
Wow.
That's a lot of mistakes.
It's a lot of mistakes.
It's a 500-page book, right? So in 1840, Joseph used the original manuscript, not the printer's manuscript, for at least some of it, likely most of it. We don't know for sure for all of it. So we have some changes, and I believe I've got about 80 footnotes where in 1837 Joseph changed something, and the 1840 version doesn't have that change.
Gotcha.
So I footnote and I add that there so you can see what he changed that was missed in his last version. And I also have places where in 1837 and in 1840 he missed a mistake that was in the printer's manuscript, where literally a whole 2 lines of the original printer's manuscript were missed and skipped.
Oh.
And that's a common Scrivener's error. As you're reading, you
Mm-hmm.
go to the end of the line and it says Korihor. And then you write down, you look back up, and 2 lines underneath it says Korihor. You think that's where you left off, so you start writing it.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Makes an ungrammatical sentence, usually,
Right.
but that happens every paragraph of the Book of Mormon. So just got ignored, but it seems pretty likely that was just a mistake. So I footnote these two, and I put it in the Book of Mormon. Here are these two things, but the footnote says from here to here was missing in both of these versions. Joseph corrected, appears to be a Scrivener's error. Reader can decide. But so those happen. There's some significant pieces that are like that are changed like that. Um, excuse me. So those are in there where he missed stuff from the original manuscript, or he changed it once and didn't change it in the other spot. That doesn't happen in the Doctrine and Covenants. I go from the later version of the Doctrine and Covenants, and if it was changed from an earlier, we've got a pretty strong lineage of the change. It's usually pretty obvious that it was changed on purpose. Whereas the Book of Mormon, we've got those printer's manuscript that's got Oliver Cowdery's mistakes every 2 to 3 a page, perpetuated into the 1837 version. And some of those are pulled out of the 1840 version by using the original, but they missed some of the changes Joseph made in 1837 that he didn't incorporate in 1840. Now, you could say Joseph rejected the change he earlier made. I think it's more likely he missed it, but I footnote it every single time so the reader can look and say, okay, here we go.
So to me, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Drew, because you're showing your work, so to speak, right? You're showing what you found.
Yeah.
This doesn't feel like, and again, correct me if I'm wrong. And it could just be my misconception of what I'm hearing here, but it doesn't sound like you're going for like, this is authoritative. This is how this goes. You don't have to worry about it or question it any longer. This is how it's supposed to be. It sounds to me more like this is what I found, and it's up to you to kind of parse through that. Is that a fair assessment?
Interesting. Yeah, it's kind of in between.
Okay.
So here's what my original goal was, and here's the goal of the team of 4 of us, but with the JSV. What we wanted was a Joseph Smith approved text,
Okay.
something that I honestly believe if the resurrected Joseph came and stood by my shoulder, sat down next to me, he would say, "That's exactly what I wanted done." Minus one thing that I think he would say, and that is, "But you left some mistakes in there that you knew were mistakes. Why didn't you fix
Gotcha.
them?" And my answer to that is, um, we wanted an addition that every restorationist could trust.
Okay. All right.
So I'm not claiming to be the prophet of everybody, and you should follow me because I said so. And because that's not what I'm claiming, and that's not how I'm perceived, I don't think it's my job to correct everything and say this is what it's supposed to read. Um, that's Joseph's business,
Right.
and, and he left it the way he left it, and it does have mistakes. There are grammatical mistakes. Um, and you could point back to I always forget his name, but the guy who got upset and apostatized because he made a grammar mistakes. He said, "This is straight from God. How dare you?" But he tells them to change it in D&C 57. There's another scripture at 70 something where the Lord says, "You are aware of Joseph's." It doesn't say it quite like this, but we all know that Joseph has bad grammar, and you're aware of it. You find it out in the Revelations, but they're still true. You
Right.
know, so um, I've left those errors, and honestly, that's been painful for me. It's really really hard. When I see something, I'm like, this looks
Right.
really. It should have said this, but I don't do that. I have to really restrain myself because what we wanted to be able to do is say, okay, here's the Joseph Smith version. I'm giving it to the Kingston group. I don't know a lot about the Kingston group. I've only really met a couple people, but I'm saying I give it to them. They can look at it and say, this was as approved by Joseph. And anything that in here that's questionable at all is footnoted, it's italicized, and it's noted so I can see what was going on here.
Gotcha.
And I can give it to somebody from Centennial Park, and they can disagree on a lot of details of what Joseph approved or what he didn't approve, but it's all right there annotated for them so they can see. And then I could go to somebody in the mainstream church, and when they quote D&C 121 and they say it says, "Let virtue garnish your thoughts unceasingly," I say, yeah, I don't know that I have any problem with that, but just so you know, that's not what Joseph wrote. It says, "Let garnish your thoughts unceasingly." It doesn't say let's like virtue garnish. It just says garnish your thoughts.
Mm.
It's an interesting tidbit, but that's what Joseph approved. Now, can I say like virtue garnish your thoughts unceasingly is a bad principle? Absolutely not.
Right.
But that might not be what Joseph had in mind. Garnish your
Right.
thoughts could just be a pensive individual. Deep and solemn thoughts can only find them out. He said about the things of God. He could have been trying to suggest that. And you could say, well, that's virtuous, but that's not the same as thinking about virtue or these types of things. It's an interesting distinction. So this is what Joseph would have approved if he was here in person. And if there are any mistakes, they're mistakes of men type thing, right? And surely there are some somewhere. That always happens when you publish something, especially if you don't have a team of 50 people on your side going over everything. Excuse me. But that was our purpose. Now, in that purpose, um, I'm not saying this is the authoritative text that Joseph wanted. It's the one he would have approved. That's how I perceive it. And I think that's very different because he may look and say, "Oh gosh, look at the size of the church now. If I were running that, I would revise these 5 sections massively." On the other hand, he might come and show up in Missouri and say, "Gosh, your group's really small. This section doesn't apply because there's not enough people to fill all those positions.
Right.
This is how you should do it." And so he may have wanted it something a little bit different and wanted to share more and he couldn't or whatever. But as far as pure text, what we have of the record, I believe that what this JSV represents is what he approved, and with annotations of all the changes that he made or he authorized to make, so that you could see all of those.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm going to ask another question here, and I'm not, well, kind of by the nature of the question, maybe a little bit.
Sorry.
No, no, I'm trying to figure out oh, screw it. There is no diplomacy. We're just going to roll with it.
Punch me,
Some,
Dave. Punch me.
yeah, I'm not trying to punch you, and I'm not necessarily trying to punch anybody. I'm just curious about this.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, the people who fund these sorts of projects have something in mind they want to see. Did
Yes.
you encounter any of that as this was happening?
Okay, great question. And yeah, we debated over some stuff because of that. One of the issues, for instance, is originally they didn't want me to do punctuation, leave
Okay.
the original punctuation, and so I did after a while, and that was so hard for me. I've now written either an editor of a text or written 26 books as of today.
Hmm.
I, it's everything I could do to not erase a comma when
Right.
I'm going through a text. That's what I do all day, every day for years, right? I mean, well, not all day, every day, but you
I
got
get
my,
it.
that's my
Yeah.
profession right now. And I've been writing books for a long time. I can't stop that hand from ticking a comma. Um, and and I'm OCD about that sort of stuff because I want my work to be perfect, and it
Right.
never will be. And there's always going to be a mistake I'm going to make, and I always get upset at myself about it. But that's my intention, is for it to be perfect. And so, not checking that grammar, that punctuation was really really difficult for me. But I didn't do it, and I didn't do it from section 13 or 14 all the way to about 95 in the Doctrine and Covenants. And in the interim, we had some phone calls, and they're kind of saying, "Make a case, Drew," and and they almost in they even said, we almost nostalgically just want what Joseph saw. I want to see what Joseph saw. I'm like, lithographic reprint, you know, that's what that is.
Right.
Uh, but if as soon as we're inserting the footnotes and all that sort of stuff, what Joseph didn't do is not necessarily inspired. I mean, I believe the words of the Book of Mormon are inspired, and I do in other DNC, but I don't believe the grammar is. I don't believe the structure is. I don't believe the punctuation is. We have no evidence of those whatsoever. So I even built a little chart, and I put it at the beginning of each of the JSVs to say, what did Joseph contribute and what did he not contribute, and who did? Where'd the verses come from? Orson Pratt, 1876. Where did the punctuation come? Drew Briney, 2025. Okay.
Right.
Um, so after we talked about that issue, and paragraphing was a similar issue. We talked about paragraphing, and we all agreed to keep paragraphing as the format because that's how they read back then, and it does change how you interpret things, because sometimes the versification chops it up in a way that you start thinking differently. I've noticed that years and years ago, and we all agreed to that. That's how Joseph did it. That's how he would have liked it. We're going to keep it like that. And it came to pass is not going to be our bar for what it is. Um, and again, this man I've never met, Royal Skousen. I honor him. I appreciate his scholarship, and I appreciate his heart. Um, Cleon Skousen's one of the amazing men of our days.
Hmm.
Tremendous heart. And I respect that he's an honest scholar and that he deems this text very sacred and treated it as such. And so we used his paragraphing most of the time, and I alluded to some changes, but there were some other format reasons we did things differently than he did, so we changed those around a little bit. Um, but that was one of the things that was a bit of a debate.
Gotcha.
With that one, I was like, I already did
Right.
it. And so I'm like, if I'm gonna have to go back and redo this, I finished the entire Book of Mormon. I'm doing this after another project because I was frustrated. Um, but later, as things went on, I pointed out things where the grammar, the punctuation was so bad and super inconsistent that it changes meaning sometimes, and that clearly is not right. It's one thing to say, well, the punctuation makes it to where happiness comes after this life or during this life. That's a big deal, but most people probably think, duh, it should be this life, and it's a minority who think that otherwise, and they're stupid, and whatever. Like, a lot of people think that way, but there are other places, excuse me, that suggest something more like Lucifer should have been the savior or something. They're just obviously wrong, and so you just ignore those types of mistakes because they're so blatantly against everything that you read.
Right.
Couldn't remotely be anything but a Scrivener error. And at any rate, I'm really sensitive about those kinds of decisions. If I think there's a slight possibility it could reasonably reread something differently, I will follow the. I'll give somebody benefit of the doubt, even if I totally disagree, like I shared earlier. But there are places where it just doesn't matter. So at any rate, and I showed enough of those places where it was just messy that they said, I think you're right. We're being more nostalgic than practical here. We want a version that Joseph would approve, but we also want people to be able to understand and read it and not be sidebarred by all the mistakes.
Right.
And same thing with spelling. That was kind of a keep the original spelling was something we talked about originally too. But it's kind of the same thing. If you look at it, you're like, what word is that? You know, and as I recall, there's one error in one of the versions. I don't remember where it's at, but it's one of those things that says pray always lets the adversary have power over you, as opposed to lest he have power over you, unless he
Yeah, that's a big difference.
yeah. And so I'm just like seeing how a typo can make a big difference like that. you know we don't want to perpetuate errors like that. That's not our goal here. I mean, yeah, we want it to be as Joseph approved, but if they made miss things that are so blatant and obvious, do we really want to suggest that that's what the gospel is supposed to be? you know
Right.
um and I footnote, all sorts of things like that, like straight and narrow is originally straight. Is that what he meant? They spelled that wrong everywhere. Even
Right.
when it had nothing to do with the possibility of something being narrow, they still spelled it wrong. So we'll leave the original and make a footnote. um, but some things are just too obvious. I mean, there's nobody that thinks it's supposed to be the son of dog. It's just
Right.
it's
No.
fix it.
Right.
It's going to be distracting to everybody reading it. It needs fixed. So
Right.
there were some things like that. So ultimately, after literally months of talking back and forth, they finally said, okay, go ahead and fix all the punctuation. And the problem with that is after I've done everything else, it's out of my head. The section's kind of gone. It's a lot longer to go back and change the punctuation. If I did the original, comparing side by side of all 4 to 7 sometimes manuscripts of the changes that were made, and I'm marking each of those up, when I go through and I'm doing the commas and stuff after, I've got all that data in my head. It's in the short-term memory still. And I'm thinking, okay, this is referring to this clause is referring back to up here. And all those connections that you make when you're deep into a text are there. So then if I'm putting a semicolon in or comma or whatever, I've got all that available to me without thinking about it. Do these two
Hmm.
sentences connected? Is this clarifying this? I already know it's just there. But if 4 months pass, you go back, you have to
Right.
redo. It's way slower and way more painful.
I bet. I bet.
So, but other than that, no, I don't think there's anything that their only agenda was we want a pure version. And when I read that or heard that, I was like, okay, that to me means clean. That means perfect. It means error free. But with the original words. What Joseph penned is sacred, unchangeable. What he didn't pen is pragmatic. That's,
Gotcha.
that's my approach on it. Uh, at any rate, we had some slight disagreements over some of those details, but nothing major. All the stuff we've already covered. Nobody wanted anything except for what honored Joseph as much as possible, and so that was the overriding feeling. And at the beginning of the book, all of them, the ones that say JSV, um, it says Joseph Smith version. It's not really a logo. It's kind of more of a oh bother. I can't think of the word, but it's just letters, but they're fancy letters.
Gotcha.
Not calligraphy, but it's just typography or something. Anyway, underneath each of those, I put honoring Joseph's revelatory words and edits through clean and accurate Joseph approved text. So that was what and that wasn't a kind of slogan that everybody agreed with per se, but that's the feeling that everybody on the committee had. We want Joseph approved. We want it as clean as possible, and we want to honor what he did. And
Gotcha.
I think that's not to say you know maybe Orson Pratt had some inspired changes or some inspired this or that when he made some changes in the 1876 version, or that person somebody in 1921 didn't make a good correction. I might 100% agree with some of the grammatical corrections they made, but the idea was we want a pure Joseph version that doesn't have Drew's taint. It doesn't have the mainstream church taint. It doesn't have anybody's taint. It's just Joseph's taint. And if there are errors left over, they're Joseph's errors. And we can look at them and decide what we want about them. But that's what's there. That said, I did change spelling.
Mm-hmm.
I did not change Old Testament or Old English in except for one version that's separate. I did not get rid of that, but occasionally, it would set, the word "were" was used. It should have been "was" or something. On very rare occasions, I corrected things like that because they really complicated things, and there's no way to read it that it would be proper.
Gotcha.
So it wouldn't be, for instance, saying, "Oh, well, I missed a subject back here." It could have been referring to this secondary noun instead of this primary noun or something, or this pronoun or whatever. There's just no way to interpret it except for bad hick language.
Okay.
and it and those were very rare. Those changes, though, it's just places where it would cause confusion, make somebody be like, "What? I just read that wrong." You go back and read it, and I don't understand. And then they remember that the introduction says they're not changing stuff. There
Right.
was a mistake by Joseph, and maybe that helps them. Probably not. Most people won't read that stuff. So it just felt like it would actually cause more problem leaving it than taking it out. But again, very few of those, and they're just like I just said. If it says "it were" and it's supposed to say "it was," there are half dozen of those maybe, and that's pretty much it. Just
Gotcha.
now,
Okay.
that said, I did do a modern English version of the Book of Mormon, and that doesn't apply at all to that.
Right.
But that's maybe a different topic. I don't know, but anyway.
Well, no, I mean that I think that would all fit and flow in here. Is that available now as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I hope so. It was supposed to be available. If it's not, it will be very, very soon, and I will at least have a digital version on my PayHip site, and we can get that on your site as well, really quickly. But when I submitted it to Amazon, they said another book has the same name, and so you have to say it's within the public domain. I fundamentally disagree with that on the modern English version, because that's not in the public domain. There was no modern English version in 1840, and I made thousands of changes to make it a modern English version, and nobody else has made those same changes. And so the copyright distinctly should be available to me for that.
Right.
Just like, if I took the original Bible manuscript and published it and then did a different translation of it, the different translation is copyrightable. I didn't go the rounds with the guys arguing with me about it because they're immediately threatening to take down all books I've ever written in this sort of
Oh,
crap.
geez.
And I'm just like, if somebody steals it, so what? They've stole my other work too. It's let them go for it. I don't think there's a huge niche market for it. I don't expect to make a lot of money for it. So it is what it is. Okay, so let me say two things there real quickly. One is the JSV paperback, whether it's the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and there's a couple different versions of Doctrine and Covenants we haven't talked about yet, but they've got some extra materials, including those extra revelations I talked about. All of those, if it's in paperback, I went to Amazon and said, "What's the cheapest price I can do this?" and kept the cheapest price that would allow me to mail it and not lose money. So my profit margin on those is like pretty much zero. It's less than $2 on all of those.
Ooh.
So I did that because we're going to have some fancy versions out, some nice versions, and a lot of people, they don't blink an eye to spend $200 on a pair of nice scriptures. They're going to use forever. We will have some nice versions of that, but I'm very sensitive to the fact that I'm not the only poor person in the world, and
Right.
I know some people have. I've got 15 kids. I know lots of fundamentalists have 20, 30 kids, and not all of them are good stewards. and you don't want to buy $100 set of scriptures for them that's just going to get wrinkled and dropped in the toilet and put with a bag of rice and whatever happens with things kids do, right?
Right.
So I wanted the cheapest version I could possibly do. And frankly, I was kind of upset because I don't know how Amazon calculates their pricing, but based on the printing cost, they should have been cheaper still, but they wouldn't let me do any cheaper. So I did that specifically for like I said, so poor people can afford them, and people who have lots of kids that don't want to spend a lot of money on a set of scriptures can do that. The hardback version is different. There's a profit margin on those, and that's uh, anyway. Lots of factors going on there. I've got different people wanting higher prices, different people wanting lower prices, and all that sort of stuff going on with those. But the intention is to make those a mid grade, like
Mm-hmm.
have the nice version later. That's the mid grade version that most people can afford and be happy for whatever the price is, but not too cheap either. Because some of the we need to recoup some of our costs in production.
Right.
um,
No, I understand.
so so two two things. One, don't let me forget the different versions of the DNC and the Modern English Book of Mormon. So I decided to do a Modern English version of the Book of Mormon for a few reasons. It's been on my mind for many years. Um, in my family, if you're 8 years old, you don't get baptized unless you read the Book of Mormon. Now, I've had some kids struggle with their reading a little bit, and so we let them listen to the Book of Mormon for some of it or all of it, or whatever, that sort of stuff. Um, but it's just been a family standard, and I want to make sure they're actually familiar with scriptures
Absolutely. Yeah.
and not just getting baptized because mom and dad said so. I want them to. We have a baptismal interview. We sit down with them and talk and ask them questions and make sure that you teach kids stuff 20 times and they forget it.
Right.
So we kind of, just before they're baptized, we go through and make sure they remember all this stuff. What is baptism a symbol of, and who are we covenanting with, and these types of things. Um, and some of my kids haven't quite been ready. They've really struggled to read the Book of Mormon, and some of them read through fine, but most of them struggled at times. And I've talked to a lot of other families, especially moms. Many dads are just kind of oblivious, but moms are not oblivious.
Right.
They're like, my child really struggles with Old English. Um, and so I've been wanting to do an easy to read Book of Mormon for the kids for a couple decades now. Uh, and there's lots of controversy over it. And I was like, geez, why is there so much controversy? I'm a convert to the church, so maybe it's easy for me. I'm like, I struggled reading it first. I'm like, what the heck is thine self? And what is smiting about? And, and whithersoever, like, what the heck does that mean? All these different Old English words. I was like, I had to learn all of them. And because I'm an academic by heart, it didn't take too long. It wasn't super hard for me. And I was a little bit
Right.
older. But then, you meet people that English was a second language, and they're like, man, I struggle English. This very hard.
Right.
What are they supposed to do? I mean, these types of resources aren't available for them in other languages, meaning, all the footnotes and cross references and Joseph Smith version stuff that I'm doing. So, at any rate, as I was doing my spell checking and making sure, I didn't put in two spaces where it should be one, and that sort of normal stuff I do for my books. As I was doing that, I realized a new method that I could go through and get rid of Old English a lot faster than in the past. Because I tried this years ago. And, I tried to do some find and replace stuff, and it was a disaster. So I was like, I can't rely on the computer. How do I do this quickly and efficiently anyway? And I found a method and I used it. And my whole purpose was just to get rid of that stumbling block of the Old English. And I did. And I also followed Joseph Smith's precedents, as it were, of getting rid of "and it came to pass" and all the different derivations. Behold, now it came to pass. Now, behold, it came to pass. Now it came to pass. And it came to pass then, behold, whatever. I got rid of all of those 2,300 and what some odd. It took away 10 pages of the Book of Mormon to delete those, but I left 3 stars with each one so that you know it's deleted.
Gotcha.
And that may not be significant. The way I see that is an old Hebrew, Egyptian vestige of their language.
Yep.
It doesn't mean much anything. It means then at most. Then this was what happened. Then this happened. Then this happened. It doesn't give any meaning. Behold, besides that. But it was so hard to write. They said it was so hard to write that I can't imagine their graving. And it came to pass. Behold, now that's a lot of work. So I personally believe they had some sort of little dash or something in Hebrew,
Right.
Egyptian, or altered, what do they call it, Reformed Egyptian, where they just kind of did a little dash that says then, and then they wrote it. But they translated it all this long, you know, gnarly sentence. But it's written in an old English sort of way, and it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
There are 2 or 3 places in the Book of Mormon where you need it, and it doesn't make sense without it. I left those, but all the rest of them I deleted, and I put the star there. And I know that'll offend some readers, but oh well. Your kids will be so much happier not to read 10 pages of It Came to Pass.
Gotcha.
um, and I got, at any rate, so I got rid of all the old English, and and I spot read places, and double checked, because at any rate, it's a longer process than just find and replace. You can't, that doesn't work. But neither does it work to do all of it all at once, because it gets complicated. So you have to kind of go through a few times. So I was spot checking stuff, and I still found vestiges of things that I missed, because I was reading it so much. You're saturated in that language, you don't notice it. But
Right.
then when you delete it and you get rid of it, you're like, oh, there it is again. you know, I didn't get rid of Huso. that's
Right.
old English. And fourth is one of those you're like, gosh, that's a modern word too, but do I get rid of the 1900 version or places where it says fourth? And you know, because you literally, some of those words have 3 or 4 meanings, and depending on context, it means something slightly different, even in 1828.
Right.
And at any rate, so I didn't want to make too many judgment calls. So sometimes I just say this is a word that meant this, and we still use it, but it has maybe some nuance differences. So at any rate, I did that for the kids. I bought immediately as soon as let me change that. The instant that it is up and available on Amazon, I will buy a couple versions for my younger kids here. And frankly, that's all I'd ever want to use personally, because I hate Old English. I just, so obnoxious. It's not helpful. And in 20 some years talking about it, I've only had one argument that was not emotional based. Even though they were trying to make rational arguments against it, they really comes down to nostalgia, or it sounds pretty. And that was, I came from Michael Ness, who I talked to recently. He said, if somebody's looking for word prints to match phrases in the Book of Mormon with the Old Testament or New Testament, they may not notice it if it's a modern English. I'm like, absolutely, that's a great point. It's a niche, but it's a great point,
Right.
But in creating it, my purpose wasn't to replace Book of Mormons. It was for kids, English second language, somebody who's new, struggles with Old English, whatever it is, that they would have something they could grab onto, read, and understand, and then graduate later to the real KSV Book of Mormon, and use that for church and that sort of stuff. And of course, I would never cite it in research, that sort of stuff, but I know I didn't change the meaning ever. And so I trust it just as much as the standard one. It just doesn't have all the archaic expressions. Uh,
Gotcha.
the one thing that did make me very angry, and I'm maybe exaggerating this, but it did make me very angry as I went through it, is as I finished and I was rereading, checking for it and stuff, is there are places where I did have punctuation based on the Old English, but once I got rid of it, I was like, oh, I actually didn't need that comma. That was really annoying. Um, but sometimes, the language is so obtuse that when you're looking at it, it's hard to get grammatical constructs and syntax or whatever, and see precisely where the punctuation belongs. You get used to it. But anyway, I did see a couple places where I could see why with the original I had the commas there, but when I got rid of the Old English, it really read better without.
Gotcha.
So,
Were you at
anyway,
all worried, you know, throughout this process, both in the modern translation as well as going back to what you thought was what Joseph would want, right?
Mhm.
Were you worried at all about first, because there is a certain beauty to the text, right? As it stood, right? Or at least maybe I found beauty in it. Or were you worried about messing up like any of the chiasmus that was found there? Does that ever happen? Right?
Right.
Some of those
So
things. Did that ever was that something that you viewed as you were doing your I don't want to say revisions because that's not the right word, but maybe your corrections.
So in the standard JSV, the answer is absolutely not, because I only did changes that Joseph made. I
Okay.
didn't make any effort to do any of that stuff on my own, and I personally did
Okay.
think about the chiasms. I've got my personal Book of Mormon. I went through a couple different books on chiasms, and I marked all of them. And some of them I believe and think are totally bogus, but I've got all of them marked in mine, and I appreciate them. So I thought about that specifically, and I think it's very unlikely that a modern English would get rid of those at all.
Okay.
For example, if I say thee, I change it to say you. If it says thou, I change it to say you. And by the way, I italicized when it was singular the word you, so you could see, much like King James version did that. In a couple instances, where they translated different words to mean God, they italicized some so that you could see this is Yahweh versus Elohim and that sort of stuff. So anyway, I did that, so that those are preserved, so you can see what was singular and what was plural in the original, which sometimes was an error, and unarguably an error, because the next sentence contradicts it otherwise. um, but I always use the same word, so I can't see that happening. That I would lose a chiasm. There was one word, I'm trying to remember what it was, but that did get translated two different ways in modern English, depending on where it was placed. I don't remember if it was when became subject to object or object subject or something like that, but it did change. So there's a slight possibility there, but I I think those common words are useless in chiasmic studies.
Okay.
And I'll give you just an example. There's a book I read. It was a honking thick book. I mean, we're talking 2 inches paperback, and it was all the chiasms in the Book of Mormon. This guy got real excited about them, and he'd found like 500. And those are the ones that I marked by color in my Book of Mormon, so that I can see all the different word choices and stuff, where they're at. And by the way, for any of the listeners, the entire book of Alma 36 is chiasmus.
Right.
And it's so amazing if you get that diagrammed out. Very, very interesting stuff. But at any rate, what I discovered was, if it's a common word like God or Jesus or something like that, um, those don't work very well when you're trying to find a chiasm, because that's used a lot.
Right.
And what I found with this guy, that's got this book that's 2 inches thick of chiasms, is he was using a lot of those really common words to find chiasms. And frankly, I think he was finding repetitious words and not chiasms.
Gotcha.
And so I don't think in transferring to the modern English that any of those would be lost, because the unique words are not changed. Like, for instance, I didn't get rid of the word smite. I looked through several definitions, and I couldn't find one that I could replace it with that didn't require a phrase.
Right.
A heavy blow to the body, or. And so I just left it there, and I footnoted what it meant. And
Gotcha.
that shows up like 80 sometimes in the Book of Mormon. And I footnoted it about 10 times and said, by now you should have this word learned, so I'm not going to do it anymore. But it's kind of one of those things to help kids that become familiar with an unusual word. But those are the words that are more likely to show up in a chiasm, and I got rid of nothing like that. Most of Old English really is just the ending ETH or EST, and thee, thou, thine, and ye, and thine self, and that sort of stuff.
Gotcha.
And when you change them in English, they're changed the same, so you don't lose that. So attendeth becomes attends, and forsaketh becomes forsakes. And so those are still going to show up in the chiasm if that's a word that's in a chiasm.
Gotcha.
So Yeah, that's it. And again, I want to emphasize, I didn't do the modern English version to replace the Book of Mormon. I did it for people who struggle with Old English,
Sure.
and for people like me, I'm familiar with Old English. I can read it, but if I'm tired and I'm reading my scriptures, I just want to be able to have a relaxing read.
Right.
I might have a deep thought, I might not, and but that's not the point. I
Right.
want to I just want to get lost in it. And that was, in fact, that was one of the things you mentioned earlier. Was there anything that we talked about? That was something we all agreed in. Is we want to make sure that even though there's quite a few footnotes in some of these texts, we want it formatted in such a way that the reader can stay engaged in the scriptures and ignore the footnotes if they want to, and not get sidetracked with all that stuff, but just to be able to have a genuine, I'm just having a scripture study and reading on my own and asking for revelation, and this is what I'm using. But you can also use it for cross-referencing or talking, looking up something that somebody isn't a genuine academic article. That won't be true with the study version. There will be lots of footnotes. You
Gotcha.
know,
Yeah.
I'm kind of known for being obsessive with footnotes, but you can have 1,000 thoughts and you can't put it all in one text. So you footnote everything.
Right.
Get
Yep.
it all there. Okay.
Absolutely.
Did you have a question?
Yeah. So going back to the DNC, I want to spend some time here on this a little bit. I got two questions. First off, um, we talk about being Joseph Smith approved. So will like section 138 be in there? Will the section where Brigham Young lines out how Zion's camp is going to march, is that going to be
Good.
in there?
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Because
I
because
forgot to talk about that.
even though those weren't penned by Joseph Smith, are those things that you could look at and say Joseph would be down with this, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
Well,
what'd
there's
you do
DNC
there?
135 too that talks about the martyrdom. He obviously didn't write that.
Right, right. And so there's a few
Yeah.
sections in there that we know he wouldn't have the opportunity on earth to approve. But what'd you do
Yes.
with those?
Thank you. I totally forgot about that. That's an important question. So they are there. And this was actually something that we debated about quite a bit because a lot of Mormon fundamentalists don't accept DNC 138 as scripture. Um, and so we looked at this and said, well, do we take it out and do our own version like Denver Snuffer did? Um, but that starts making judgment calls and so forth unless we only exclude non-Joseph revelations and just do it that way. So we thought about that. But at the end of the day, the kind of the vote came out. I think there's 3 or 5 sections or something that are like that at the very end, where basically we just said the vast majority of restorationists have these scriptures. We don't want to renumber things and cause confusion, you know. So it's not like it's like, okay, it ends with Joseph and then there's Brigham and the others. It's not like that. It's chopped up a bit. So we'd have to restructure those numberings. So then I might say, oh, I'm reading the Joseph Smith version and DNC 135 says this. And you're like, wait a second, that's not my DNC 135.
Gotcha.
That's going to create confusion when people are researching. And, like for instance, again, I'm reading this book and it quotes DNC 137. I go to mine, it's not there. I know what's going on. A lot of people are going to not know what's going on, but somebody else might say, why is that not the same? And then it's
Right.
cause confusion. So because of that, we opted to keep them. And and part of the goal with the study version and also with the non-canonical revelations that are included there, because of all that, part of the goal also is to be able to say, here, restorationists, you can see what everybody else is believing too, and what they're reading, and have an understanding where they're coming from. And
Mm,
you personally don't agree with DNC 138. You think it's Song of Solomon type thing, and just cross it out and call it good. But now when somebody cites it, you've got access to it as well. So let me jump from there to the non-canonical stuff. One of the things that I was personally passionate about years ago is and I don't know what number I had. I had like 30 revelations of Joseph Smith that weren't published. And I was like, why is the DNC not been amended to include these?
Mm-hmm.
You can find answers, that some of the stuff he said don't publish that right away. The Saints aren't ready for it, or maybe that's implied, but he says, include this, but we'll put this in a future version, but not this version, or there's some vestiges of thought that way. And I think there's a quote from George Q. Cannon. I think he's the person that said it. That basically said some of the stuff wasn't published because the Saints weren't ready for it, and so that's why they weren't canonized. But that doesn't mean they're not true, type thing. So I've wanted to have that in my DNC for a long time because I don't care if it was canonized or not. If Joseph received it as a revelation and he was a prophet, it's true. And I don't care if anybody voted on it or not. George Q. Cannon talks about that too. He says the voting process to see if something is canon is just to see if the saints will be obedient. Joseph had no belief that whether or not his revelations were true was dependent on a council of people voting on it. That's totally contrary to his prophetic role. He knew better. But the vote was to put the saints in a position of accountability before God, that they said, yeah, I sustain that. I agree that's scripture. And if they don't, they're under condemnation. If they do, then they're expected to do it. So to me, I don't care if it's canonized or not as far as the truth of it goes, but I want everything that he revealed. So at any rate, I've been compiling that and preparing that for many years. And I just finished with the DNC and in doing the tedious 2 months of punctuation stuff that I was talking about earlier. And if anybody reads the entire book of Doctrine and Covenants in so many hours, it says how to take that much longer to punctuate. Remember, I was trying to understand, does this clarify this or not? That really takes a lot of time. And
Sometimes us laymen, we don't need to know how the sausage is made, right? Look, I enjoy a
right,
good
right.
I enjoy a good brat. I don't need to know where it's coming from necessarily, right?
Right.
Just serve me the brat with some sauerkraut. I'm good.
It's true. I think a lot of people are like that, but a lot of people too are like, well, Joseph wrote it sacred. And so it's important to understand what he did and didn't do and how somebody approached fixing that. And I do tend to be pretty sensitive about that. But at any rate, so I spent decades getting all this stuff ready, and I'm finally ready to publish it. And I'm like, yes, because okay, so I'm publishing the DNC. Lectures on Faith is included. Publishing Lectures on Faith with DNC 1 to 138. It's published. It's done. Now I'm going to do the version that adds the non-canonized version. And what happens?
That
This
dude comes
appears
out with it.
all over Facebook. And I'm like, I don't know who these guys are, but I want to punch him in the face. Not really, but you know what I mean? It's
I know what
like,
you mean.
what? No, I've been preparing for this for months. No, they did something. And as it turned out, it's a very different product than what I was trying to produce. So it's all awesome, and I'm super glad. I'm super glad they did it anyways.
Yeah.
They'll hit an audience I don't hit. So I'm being facetious and teasing in all those ways, but it's still kind of a big slap in the face. You're like, oh. But that said, they include, I could get these numbers a little bit off. They're going to be pretty darn close. They include, I think, 38 major revelations of Joseph Smith, and then 4 honorable mentions / this might be a revelation of Joseph. So they get 42 total, I think, is what they ended up with. I found 65, and then I found 22 more that were hearsay accounts. I included all of them, so that's 87 as opposed to 42. Now, they did the typical standard mainstream Mormon thing. These are the ones in the Joseph Smith papers. These are the ones that we see in his own handwriting or that somebody received, and we've got the record of him giving it to him. And that's all well and good. That's great. That's super important stuff. But it doesn't include somebody who says, I was there when Joseph gave this revelation. And this is basically what it said. And those hearsay revelations, those 22 extras that I had, we don't have the original revelation written. We have somebody saying Joseph received this revelation. I was there when he did it. So those are not as reliable but I think there's a fundamental problem, religiously speaking, of not including it for people to look at. So let
Okay.
me just give you an example. Well, of course, the only one I can think of is controversial. Give me a non-controversial one, Drew. Figure it out.
Dude, you forget
Okay.
where you are. Do the controversial one.
Right. Okay. Okay. Um, Zebedee Coltrane says, I was having an argument with, I think it was JP Green. I don't remember. I tend to not care about this uh, topic of discussion all that much. Anyway, he's arguing with this other elder, and they're arguing about whether or not there's a ban on the priesthood against the blacks or not.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm pretty positive it's Zebedee Coltrane because he's controversial for this very topic. But he said, we came to Brother Joseph Intruder's word. This other elder brought up this subject and said, Zebedee says this, and I say this, and they're entitled to the priesthood, and Zebedee says they're not. And who's right and who's wrong? And Zebedee Coltrane reports Joseph bowed his head, like he did that all the time. He just kind of bow his head to receive revelation, and he'd look up and he'd give the revelation. And he said he bowed his head and he looked up and said, Brother Coltrane is right. They have no entitlement to the priesthood. Okay. So lots of reasons that's controversial. I don't
Sure.
want to get in any of them, frankly. Um, and I've got one friend who'd probably be mad at me just for including it in the book. But nonetheless, we have somebody reporting Joseph received this revelation. This is what he said. So now let's assume, and just for the point of argument for all the listeners here, let's assume that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's hearsay, so I reject it because we don't have the original writing. Now, if that's truth and I just rejected it, what do we know about that? Well,
Right.
Alma 12 tells me that that means the adversary can take more truth and light knowledge away from me, and I'm damned for not believing the truth. That's a bad thing. Now, let's assume it's false. Okay. So Zebedee Coltrane made it up. He's just a lying stinker and he's a bad guy and he made it up because he's racist. Right. Now, if I reject it because it's hearsay, that's good. But and if I reject it because it's not true, that's at least better because I'm exercising discernment, I'm praying about it, I'm finding out. But I at least think people deserve to know that somebody said, Joseph said this was a revelation. Now at least I can educatedly look at it, read it, and say, Father, is this true? And if it's not, then I can cross it out in my version. And if it is, I can now have something that I didn't have before, like knowledge I didn't have before. I think it's just as damning to reject truth for whatever reason as it is to accept false things. They both have eternal consequences if we're talking about moral things and gospel
Sure.
things. And so I include all of them in I've got a separate section.
Okay,
And
that's where I was going. With those,
so
because go ahead. Sorry, I don't know. Throwing my
so
3 cents.
we debated a little bit about this, had some discussion, but basically what I've done is I've said Joseph Smith number 1, Joseph Smith number 2, Joseph Smith number 3. And ironically, the number 1 is one that's debated if Joseph or Oliver Cowdery received the original revelation, but I footnote that. So, but if we have a revelation that's written and we believe it's Joseph's, it just says Joseph Smith 1 to 65.
Right.
And so they're there. We've got some source church history, or it's quoted. It's in church history, or it's somewhere where we have. Sorry, I was just actually getting a text from one of the guys that is part of the
Oh,
GSB, and I thought, oh shoot, he said, Drew, shut up, man. But actually, it's a totally different topic. At any rate, point is, so, oh, sorry.
no, you're good.
Okay. So it's 1 through 65. And those are the ones that we're pretty darn sure that he received and wrote. And we have the revelation and so forth. I say that a little bit tongue in cheek because I've got looser standards that way than Smoot and Pasentino. And I respect what they're doing and why and all that sort of stuff. But I also think if there's a little bit of doubt, fine, just tell the readers. We're not totally positive. Somebody said Joseph revealed this to them and they wrote it down, but they could be lying, or we don't know for sure. But we've got the written revelation, and this is what they said. So those things, one through or number Joseph Smith, 1 to 65. I've got another 100 revelations of Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, so on. Those will be in future volumes that we'll be doing. That won't be Joseph Smith version, but it will be, I don't
Gotcha.
know, restoration version or something. But at any rate, those are all separated somewhere else. But then if we have something like I mentioned earlier, where somebody says, I asked Joseph about this, he said he received a revelation and this is what it was. That's in the hearsay section. And those are numbered, but they don't have a big title. It says Joseph Smith number 1. It's just like on the page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 22.
I see.
Uh,
So you did break it out. That would,
yeah.
no matter what the topic was, right? Because we do have, and this is why Mormon history can be so messy, right? Because Joseph didn't just speak to groups at large, he spoke to individuals as well in prophetic terms, right? On prophetic terms. And so it's always hard to sort that stuff out, right? Because you don't have multiple guys saying, I heard him say this, right?
Yeah.
It's one dude. No matter what the topic is. There's been stuff I've encountered that I really want to hang my hat on that I just really can't, right? Because it's one dude, one time, and it never comes up again. And then I'm like, well, I don't know what to do with this, right? I really want to believe it, but I can't.
Yeah.
I can't put 100% confidence in there. So breaking it out into different sections, right? Like you were saying, like the hearsay section or however you put it.
Yeah.
I think is absolutely worthwhile. I think that's a good thing. As much as we can have on him, I think is good, even when it maybe conflicts with our view. And then you leave it up to the reader to sort through that and allow them to come to their own conclusions. So let me ask you this. With the DNC, the JSV version, are you going to include like the 4 unpublished revelations that maybe weren't received by Joseph, right?
Right. So, good. That's back to where I was saying earlier. Make sure I cover the different sections. So, I've got one version that's just DNC, which means lectures on faith plus 1 to 138. That's it. That's all. That's what it is. I've got another version that's lectures on faith, DNC 1 to 38, and 87 unpublished revelations Joseph. All those are Joseph Smith version. And we discussed about 134 or whatever it is through 138 to have some non-Joseph texts in there. But other than that, everything's Joseph, everything. And when we produce the triple, which I'm hoping to have out in a couple months, you're going to do the same thing that we just did with the Pearl of Great Price. When the triple's done, that will be a JSV. It will not include the 4 hidden revelations and the 100 revelations of the other brethren that are non-canonized. That will be a different version, probably a study version that we keep saying next year, but I don't know if I could pull it off that fast. If it's just the DNC, maybe. If I had more support and more funding, I could get that done in 5 months. But without that happening, somebody that's full-time paying my bills, I've got to sell stuff. I've got to work on marketing and media, and I've got to do all those other things. So there's just no way to pull that off. So long as I have to make other money.
Right. I get it.
So we keep saying next year, but maybe it's 2-3 years. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But in the meantime, that's what the version is right now. The future, yes, I definitely want a DNC that has all of them. And then that becomes a question, well, where do you stop?
Right.
And I think I personally stop Joseph F. Smith. And I don't know, besides the At any rate, I don't know of any that are unknown of his. I don't know of any non-canonized versions of his. But if we go later than that, when you've got the different versions of the restorationists, geez, I
Right.
mean, you've got the entire second book of commandments. You've got Fred Collier's got like 1,300 pages of revelations or something. I don't know exactly, but he's got a lot. um, those are volumes all by themselves. And then you've talked to guys like Jeff Foley that know all the guys translating different records, saying that they're the one mighty and strong, or that they've got the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon or whatever. All these other revelations, those are many volumes of that, and it doesn't end. So I see it ending somewhere around there, maybe Lorenzo Snow or something. I haven't looked into that carefully, but that would be kind of the end of where most fundamentalists, except those the first 5 or 6, 7 brethren,
Gotcha.
um, you know, and I know that's not true for everybody. A lot of people are like, it's Joseph and nobody. Then fine, get your Joseph Smith version. You're happy. Some are like, after Brigham it's over, or after Wolf of Woodruff it's over. But I think it's still important. Is me talking to somebody in the AUB, or is you talking to somebody in FLDS or Centennial Park, or somebody talking to Kingston's, wherever their different groups end their acceptance of these non-canonical revelations, we still have a lot of, as it were, friends, or associates in the fundamentalist community who believe a lot, like 98% of the same things.
Right.
They also believe in this revelation by Lorenzo Snow you might not accept.
Right.
Or like the 1880 revelation is responsible for the split between Centennial Park and FLDS. So one's going to accept it, one's not. But it's really helpful to know it's out there and why it's important and how that changed our histories altogether.
Right.
I think that's really, really helpful. So that will be a newer volume again, maybe a couple, 2, 3 years. I don't know exactly. I suppose without annotating it, I could just do all those non-canonized revelations of the early prophets or something all by itself. I just hadn't thought about that till this moment.
Okay. No, that's good stuff. All right, I got a couple other questions I want to ask to wrap up, but I want to make sure that there's nothing that we glossed over as we've been talking here that you really wanted to put forward.
Okay. I don't have anything coming to mind other than um, it's kind of unrelated, I guess. It's a little bit
Okay.
unrelated. I've got my own podcast and newsletter, and I talk to people about things like this. And I'm my DNC annotated is founded on this JSV. That's what I wanted to do in the first place. And so now that I've done all the horrible, tedious grunt work of this, now I can do all the fun stuff. So
Right.
I'm back to doing my annotated stuff as soon as possible. I'm also going to be working on the Pearl of Great Price. So I've got to balance that out a little bit, which again is a partially a money issue, and partially I've got promises that I'm going to get this done. I want people to feel assured that I'm still working on it, and I will get their volumes out that I promised. um, but I right now I'm looking at what do I publish next: 132, 84, 88, 93. Those are the 4 big ones that kind of get brought up the most when I'm like, what should I do next?
Right.
I did the entire, just for context, I did the entire DNC 42 on a dinner conversation where one of the guys asked me about it and wanted to know the answer, and I didn't have the answer, and I didn't know what to do next, so I did DNC 42 for him.
Gotcha.
So, and it took me like a couple months. So,
Wow.
um, so if any of the readers are interested, or say, man, get DNC 132 done, or no, you got to do Oath of the Covenant of the Priesthood 84, get that done, or 93 or whatever. I don't know if you got comments on your stuff. Maybe you don't, but
Sure I do.
you can always text me on Facebook, direct message me on Facebook or something, and say, Drew, get this done. This is important. Here's why. I'm really responsive to that kind of stuff. I know I've been approached by a few different people saying, jump in on this, the polygamy denier debate, and, do a talk or do a paper, or, that sort of stuff. And I haven't decided to jump on that particular bandwagon yet. I think it's real important, but I really burn out on that topic.
I hear
Um,
you.
so I don't know that I could be a good voice as other people could be on that. I feel like I'd be kind of dismissive of those those arguments. Oh, well, that doesn't count because this. I'm like, that's not how history works, sweetheart.
Right.
No good
Good
historian
sweetheart. Did you have
thinks
somebody
like
in
that.
mind in particular?
uh,
Drew, come on,
no,
Drew.
no, no,
Come on, Drew.
nobody in
Come
mind.
on, Drew. Who'd you have in mind? That sounded like you had someone in mind.
so so I just I haven't jumped on that bandwagon, but I am really responsive. If somebody says, we'd really like to see this volume, I'm right here thinking, okay, I'm gonna hit that first. And I'm almost to the point where I'm ready to jump on that. And so if anybody has some input, or they're like, maybe you're not aware of this movement, but we got to get this DNC 132 done or something, let me know. And I'm open to be responsive about that. Also, I one thing that I do want to point out is I would expect, um, possibly into summer, I would expect that we'll have a triple combination JSV ready for uh, readers, podcasters, whatever, listeners. That will be published through Pioneer Press, which is Kevin Kraut's publishing company. He's been looking for the best deal for many months. If my text is right, he just got approval for something, decided on somebody, and that will be a really nice gold gilded pages with the nice, looking like a normal set of scriptures, but hopefully one that you can trust and not wonder who changed what, how much,
Gotcha.
who changed this. That's a really common problem with fundamentalists. They're like, well, I kind of believe it, but I'm always worried about something, and that's what we've tried to get rid of. At any rate, those should be available, I'm hoping, by the end of the summer. And but Kevin Kraut's the one you want to keep your eye on. And I don't know if he's got a website that he keeps track of his publications or not. I should probably find out and put one up for him if he doesn't. But regardless, if you're looking for them, he's the man to look for. I will also be talking about it and probably blogging about it, and likely talk about the Pearl Great Price with you on a future podcast or something. So
Absolutely. That'll be awesome.
that's where to look, for now, for those things. And if anybody has suggestions on reconsider your format or reconsider this, or what about adding this or whatever, I'm open to all the critique. Our purpose really is to have a version all restorationists can trust, all restorationists can feel good about, and we can use to kind of unify us better, and understand each other better with a set that we can truly hold on to.
Perfect. And yeah, anyone can message me and I'll get the message to Drew. Unless it's hate mail. I'll filter that for Drew. I'm used to
Thanks,
the
I
hate mail.
appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I'm used to that.
I get plenty of it too, but well,
What
I shouldn't say that. I actually don't for my religious stuff. Not hardly at all anymore. But
I was gonna say, someday I'm gonna publish a book and it's gonna be called People Have the Darndest Things to Say About Dave. And it's just gonna be the most witty hate mail I get, right? Because I
right,
laugh at it, right? So all I'm gonna say is, for those who like to drop those, you gotta step that game up, right? If you want an entry in that book someday, you gotta
right,
step your game up. You can't be coming in halfway. If you're gonna insult me, I expect you to be witty and funny while you do it.
right. Read some Shakespeare first.
Right, absolutely.
He's got some really good
I
insults.
expect some highbrow kind of insults coming my way. I don't. To finish up, I got these two questions.
Okay.
What was your biggest takeaway as you were doing this project? I mean, what was the thing that you were most either surprised, or something that really stuck with you as you were going through this process? Was there something that kind of an overarching theme as you were doing this, that you took away from this experience of doing this?
Yeah, thank you. In fact, I'm considering a whole book on the topic. So let's hit your other question first. You said you
Okay.
had two.
What is it you hope people that buy these scriptures get out of this?
Oh, that's a really good question. Um, you know, um, I gave a PDF copy to one of the guys, and he was reading through it, and he found that DNC 121 thing that I talked about earlier, where it says garnish your thoughts unceasingly. It doesn't say like virtue garnish your thoughts. Um, those are the types of changes that may or may not be super significant, but we all know the church has made thousands of them. And the mainstream LDS church, that's what most everybody's using their scriptures. And I don't have a beef with their scriptures per se. I'm not bad mouthing it. They needed to change stuff. I mean, if I was in charge of a church and I had a disaster mess like the grammar that's in the Book of Mormon Doctrine and Covenants, I'd be talking to somebody about fixing it too. Um, and so I don't think that's bad in any way. Um, whether or not we agree on what they changed, how they changed it, is maybe a different issue. But we I respect the fact that they did change it, and I respect why. But that said, a lot of people really struggle with some of their changes, and I think thousands of people, thousands of restorationists wonder what they changed.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people apostatize when they find what was changed. Fundamentalists aren't going to do that. They're going to say, see, told you so.
Right.
um, but we don't have anything. And that's bothered me for decades. Like, okay, so I'm fundamentalist now, and I believe what the early brethren taught. So where's our scripture? Oh, well, we just
Right.
use the church's version. Well, you guys know there are like thousands and thousands of changes they've made, right? Uh, yeah, but it's not worth our tithing money to do our own version. Like, what's wrong with these people? I just could not fathom that. I'm like, you're supporting all these other tidbit projects. I mean, a group ought to be able to throw 50,000 at somebody and say, take 3/4 of a year and do this, or a committee or something. Here's 100,000, get it done. This is
Right.
the most important thing we could have in our libraries and maybe in all of our spiritual knowledge and so forth. And we don't even have the interest to create a volume that is as true to the original as possible. I couldn't fathom that. And I was like, what is wrong with us? Where are our priorities? It really disgusted me, to be honest.
Right.
And I just couldn't fathom that. So what I hope people get from this is finally here. This is what we needed and should have had 100 years ago, when there's first a split, and the fundamentalists were first migrating away from the church because they're rejecting plural marriage because of whatever. And the split happens. We need our own version, our own set that doesn't have the 1890 manifesto in it, but that does have you know uh, all these non-canonized versions or revelations of Joseph in it. Like, why aren't these added? And you know I just want people to feel like I finally have what I want.
Gotcha.
This is a scripture version I wanted. And to be honest, I'm annoyed that there are a lot of grammatical errors in it. you
Right.
know, but Joseph left them there, and so I'll just skim over those. But I'm glad to have something that I can trust and not wonder about. Which is the same reason I'm doing the TPGS, or complete teachings of Joseph Smith, with the original sources and annotated what they changed, so you can read what he really taught and not what the early brethren interpreted that he taught or whatever. Same idea. I just want everybody to be able to have a version they can trust and say, oh, well, here's this error, and go look at an 1840 lithographic copy that I'm happy to give out for free. You can get them online, and you can compare it and say, oh, Drew, this is different. What happened here? And I can say, oh, shoot, let me look that up. Let me see. Oh, 1835 and 37 had this, 40 didn't. I forgot to footnote that. It'll be in the next edition. I'm happy to fix stuff like that. So that's what I want people to have is that opportunity to have one that they know all of this was approved by Joseph, and here are the changes that he made, and now I can move from there. I can compare to the other versions, and when my friend in the church quotes a scripture, I can look at mine and see if I trust it or not, or if it's
Gotcha.
the same, or if they've got a valid point, or if something dramatically got changed there, like the common D&C 89 says I'm supposed to be a vegetarian.
Yeah, that's the biggest heresy of them all.
It really is. Anybody who believes you can't eat bacon is just not a good person. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. For those who don't know me, I'm just teasing. Okay, so what did I get out of this? That actually, I'm planning a book, and I haven't gotten through it. I've kind of outlined some of it, but what really, what this did to me was, and I mean it like that. What this did to me, how this affected me, is it really pounded into me the process of revelation.
Mm,
Um, this that I mentioned this in the introduction and stuff. They're Jeremiah in I think it's Jeremiah 17 or something. I don't know. It's in the book. Go find it. he he dictates a revelation that was lost because it was burned.
mm,
Joseph Smith says, I can give you 100 times what's in D&C 76. Anytime. Hiram Smith said, what if Emma Burns D&C 132 says, don't worry, I can reproduce that whole section of Doctrine and Covenants anytime I want.
mm.
Um, and Brigham Young says, I don't think there's ever been a perfect revelation given because God gives revelations to us according to our light knowledge, our ability, and our language, and that changes all the time.
Right.
So that's why it says if Joseph retranslates the Book of Mormon 100 times, and it's always different, or 50 times or 500 times, whatever he says, it's different, same place 50 times every time, it doesn't bother him. And I've thought a lot about that in terms of the Book of Abraham and the use of the Urim and Thummim and the seer stone. A lot of these things I've received, and I think most listeners can relate to this, but they just haven't thought about applying it to the prophet. Maybe I've received revelations where I clearly understood part of it, and some of it I'm thinking I wasn't certain about this part. We see that with Nephi in the Tree of Life, where he says the waters were filthy, but Father was so busy looking at other things he didn't notice the filthiness of the water. But I noticed, and that was a big deal. When
Right.
he's teaching his brothers, he tells them that. So we see a prophet's given a vision, a revelation, and he sees pieces and he misses other pieces. He doesn't comprehend something until later. It maybe comes to you. And I've mentioned this to a number of people, and one of my favorite people in the world, I mentioned it to him, and he's like, "Yep." I immediately resonated with him. I said, have you ever given a blessing and you kind of stumble over some words at one point,
Mm-hmm.
and you give the blessing to somebody, they're talking to you later, and they're like, "Well, what about this?" And you're like, "Okay, so glad you mentioned that because I had this impression I didn't know how to say it, and I don't know if I can say it right now either, but this is." And you start explaining it, and then you clarify that part of the revelation, so it makes more sense. Um, you might have thought, and I've had this experience too, where you give a blessing, you think, "Oh, that was clear as day, the council," but then they misunderstood it, you know.
Right.
And then you look at a written revelation, and you're like, "Oh, well, we both read this differently." And certainly when Joseph received it, he had a certain understanding, and you're right and I'm right, or vice versa. He knew what the answer was, but we don't because it's written, and
Right.
he's not there to clarify it. And he used a bad grammar or something, you know, because he used take grammar, and that was just who he was. It was just his background. It's not good or bad. It's just who he was.
Right.
And so in this process, as I'm looking and seeing the changes that Joseph himself made, and then undid, and then redid sometimes. And I haven't looked at this one for a long time. I'll know better next time we talk because this is in the Pearl of Great Price. But he translated or whatever. He's writing down. He says, "And Enoch wept" when he's talking to God, and then he crosses it out. And the next version says, "And God wept." And then it crosses it out. They both cry, and God tells Enoch to quit crying. Right? So wow, that back and forth. You know, he 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 wrote it down a few different times. Those are contrary accounts of what happened, but maybe not. Maybe he just was remembering different details at different times, and he finally got it resolved at the end. And that happens too. I mentioned this in a previous podcast where Grandpa tells a story, and we're like, "Oh, that was a great story, Grandpa. What happened to this guy after?" And he's like, "Oh, I forgot to mention that." And then he tells that part of the detail that wasn't there before. And some newer historians, quote unquote, pseudo historians, are taking those later accounts and saying, "Oh, he embellished the story." I'm like,
Right.
"Oh, he answered a question." And I see Revelation a lot the same, where Joseph is receiving something, he's explaining it. Later, he explains it somewhere else better. D&C 19:7 talks about some scriptures being more express or clear than other scriptures. And so, I've seen the changes, hundreds and thousands of these I've reviewed, where he changes a word or two, and it's like, oh, he's just trying to make this easier to read. He
Right.
strikes out the these and the thines and that sort of stuff and puts you and yours, and it reads smoother, and it makes a difficult passage smooth. But he doesn't do it everywhere because he doesn't have time, I think, is what it boils down to. But I see all these changes. And then other places, he's changing the elders to the high council. You can see what he's doing. You can look at it and say, he's trying to say, okay, the church has changed now. This revelation is good in principle theory concept, but in details for administrative stuff, it needs fixed. So fix it. So then when I read Joseph talking to William W. Phelps and saying, hey, edit it, correct it, but don't change the sense of it, now I've come to a much deeper appreciation of that. One of the things I teach my kids is I say, look, when you're first going through, and you're in Sunday school, you got a teacher, and they're teaching you stuff, they're telling you stories. Learn Noah's Ark, learn David and Goliath, learn Jesus and the woman at the well, right? But later, you don't care about the story. You care about the message, the
Mm-hmm.
moral of the story. That's what matters with gospel stuff. And if I'm reading that in the text, that helps me understand it better. And you can read a lot of Revelation, for instance, on making your calling election made sure. And in D&C 76, it talks about they will have all things given to them. But the
Right.
poetic version says they have all of those things given to them. Well, which is it? Is it that they received it or it's future? Um, um, we can look at those things very academically and say Joseph made a mistake or Joseph made an error or these types of things. But I look at them very, very differently. I can't read that way. I can't think in this kind of a detached critical mode anymore because I don't care about those things. I care about what the truth is and what the revelation was that he taught and what the message is behind it and how I should change my life to live according to that. That's what I care about. I don't care if there were 7 animals or 2 of each or 7 of each. If there's symbolic value behind that, I can consider that and ponder it. But I don't need to remember that tomorrow when I've got one of my kids is really upset because a bully is picking on him at school. It doesn't matter. But if I understand the purpose behind it and the intent and the sense of it, as Joseph says, that's what really, really matters. And as I was looking and reviewing these thousands and thousands and thousands of changes and considering the commas and the semicolons and all this pedantic stuff that most people are never going to care about, um, it really kind of brought home to me the whole purpose is what is the meaning of this passage. And I have to think about that super, super carefully to make sure I don't change it. But the ultimate purpose is to learn the truth behind it. And as I was reading that, I saw more and more of that the weakness of Joseph in his language. To anybody that studied it super carefully is undeniable. Um, you know, he's one of my biggest heroes and favorite people in the history of mankind, but he didn't know how to write properly. It wasn't his upbringing. It wasn't what he was there for. It wasn't his gift, and it didn't matter. God
Right.
even said, you're familiar with all of his guffaws and his hick language. You know his weakness, but that doesn't make the revelation not true. that whole concept is saying, um, look at the intention of what's being said and not all the little picky things of what's being said. That reminds me of one time I was at a meeting in AUB, and a number of the people there say things in a way that's awkward to an outsider. And when I was first there, I was like, "What? What did they just say?" And I turned to a friend and I said, he just said this thing that's so doctrinally inaccurate. Like, what's he thinking? And they would say, "Oh no, brother so and so, he's I know him really well. What he's trying to say is this," and they'll explain what he was trying to say. And I'm like, "Oh, I could kind of see that as not what he said really, but I could see how he might have intended to say that. I'll take your word for it because you know him really well, and I don't. He's a stranger, right?"
Right.
Um, but their approach to that, listening to a discourse, was so different than me. I'm trying to get the meat of the gospel out of it, and they're trying to say, what's he really trying to get at? What's his intention? Um, Rather than the semantic details, the pedantic little pieces that you can bicker about.
Right.
Um, and so I think for me, reading the Revelations, reading the Book of Mormon, reading the Bible, I spent many months studying all the changes in the Bible, not just Joseph's changes, but the early Christian church changes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all of that is just really pointed to me that God allows thousands of errors in His Word to go out among the children of men, and I really think He doesn't care.
Wow.
Um, what He's saying is, look, you're going to find that contradiction. Jeremiah said the stupidest. What was he thinking? I taught him better, But he
Right.
said this thing that's just off, and that's going to make people struggle with what Christ says, you know, thousands of years later when they've got both records. And it's going to be a stumbling block for some of them. And he says, I don't care. That they're supposed to rely on me. Ask me to clarify. Talk to me about it, you know, and quit. Use it as an opportunity, a springboard to learn more, rather than to say, oh, well, maybe there's this the documentary hypothesis of somebody revising the scriptures with malintent, which is a, a theory about
Right.
Deuteronomy. Um, yeah, I really think it's just very different than that. He's like, I really don't care about a lot of these details. I want errors there so they can see humanity behind the prophet, but to look to me to find the understanding. And I've quoted it before. There's a quote in the Gospel of Kylity I truly love, and it's because it's rare that I like to emphasize it, not because it's like the foundation of my gospel or something. But in this Gospel of Kylity, Christ says, "Do not say something is right or wrong, only right or wrong according to the law."
Mm.
And his whole point is saying, don't judge people on morality stuff, only if it's right or wrong according to the law, because they may be operating on a higher law than you, and you just don't know. God hasn't given you all the light knowledge. There's more yet to receive. So before you go judging other people for what they're doing, make sure for me first that you're on the higher plane than they are, because a lot of times we're not. And just as a simple example of this, if you ask any fundamentalist, what's the higher law, plural marriage or monogamy? They're going to say plural marriage. You talk to anybody in the mainstream church, and they're probably going to say monogamy. And they're both judging each other for being wicked and apostate or something, And instead of just saying, well, the prophet told me this, or the prophet told me that, or my prophet says, and your prophet says, we should just be saying, okay, according to the law, polygamy is against the law. It's a misdemeanor. But that's where we stop saying stuff at some level, and look and say, okay, let me take this to the Lord now and find out who's right about this issue, and not to spend my life judging other people and he blessed the sacrament, and he blessed it and then he broke it. But Christ clearly says to break it first in third Nephi. That's an important issue if I want to live my life properly. But I'm not going to waste any time judging anybody about that because the intention behind it is contrary to the judgment. And so I've learned so much about the whole process of revelation. At one point, this is something new I found out. Joseph Smith used the seer stone to receive revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants. We know that. He used it to translate the Book of Mormon. We know that. But when he stopped using it and he just started receiving revelation, like, just a second, brother, let me pray. Okay, here's the revelation. When he started doing that, it was a stumbling block for the saints. He said, how can you be a seer unless you have a seer stone?
Interesting.
But he responded, somebody asked him, he said, I don't need it anymore. I grew in the principle of I grew in the principle of revelation to the degree I don't need that crutch.
Interesting.
And so there are these different levels of revelation, and I might receive a revelation and try and convey it to you and say it in such a way that it's a stumbling block and you reject it, but it's true. And on the other hand, I might do the same thing to somebody else. They receive a revelation. I'm like, these apocalyptic guys, they just, they don't even know what they're talking about, and blow it off. And I'm not ready for the second coming. We're so caught up in these different things, but the process of revelation we're not so familiar with. So we get deceived and we make mistakes. And Joseph taught quite a lot about that because of the mistakes that happen in Kirtland with people getting deceived. But at the end of the day, there's a growth in revelation and what you learn and how it works that I think if people understood better, we'd have less deception, less confusion. And at any rate, so on a personal basis, what did I learn? That's what I learned a lot about. I just completely feel like I much more deeply understand this process of revelation from a prophet's perspective, from God giving information to his prophet's perspective, and appreciating that more. I think in the past I've been maybe more frustrated that I want the perfect revelation. I want the perfect understanding. I want all of it in one spot, right? That's maybe part of my motivation between the complete teachings of the Joseph Smith as it came from his mouth and not as it was changed. I want to know from the source, Um, but even that's not, it's not good enough. Sometimes you just got to get it straight from God, and learning to understand that process is a lifelong thing. Joseph said, I think it's in TPGS 149 to 151, somewhere around there, where it might be 180. Dang, I really should learn that better. But he says, when you are thinking about something, you're praying about it, and later you notice ideas coming to your mind and they're growing and they start impressing things upon you. As you notice that, you're recognizing that's revelation, and then you slowly grow in that principle.
Mm.
People tend to think, I received a revelation and here are the words on the page of what the revelation was. And that's the revelation. And I think that's missing the boat. Those are the words that you received, yeah, but what was the intention behind those words? What's the meaning behind it? I can write down, I have other sheep I have which are not of this fold. This is revelation Jesus gave us. He said, other sheep I have, and I wrote it down and put it in my book. I didn't have the sense to ask him who they were. That was his whole intention. He said, Father told me not to tell unless they asked. So I told them, other sheep I have. You gonna ask? And they didn't ask, so I didn't tell them. And he's telling this to the Nephites, and he just got done telling him he was going to leave to go visit his other sheep still. Did they ask? No. So they got the words, right, but they didn't get the meaning. He's right. Like, I'll tell you who it is. Who wants to know? Nobody? Dang. My other apostles didn't want to know either. So frustrating. I want to share with you so much more, but you're just not getting the real gist of what this is about. And at any rate, so I think that we get this idea that the revelation is the words on the page, or the scriptures, the words on the page, and how we're supposed to interpret it is important. But a lot of times that's kind of missing a lot of the message. It's other little details. And I'll say this as an example. I presume listeners, readers have had similar experiences, and I'm not touting any specific thing to me, but just as an example, have you ever received um, a really short revelation, but the significance of those two sentences, or even I've had one word, was so massive and extensive and expansive. I pondered for days about those two sentences, or the one word, or the massive expansive ideas those brought to my mind and that I understood from those words. The Spirit speaks to us not just in words, but in emotions and feelings, and expanding our mind and so forth, and suggesting concepts and ideas and visualizations. Even we've got very apocalyptic dreams by some of the Old Testament men that are very visual, and all of these things can be shown to us and mean way more than we can express. I
Absolutely.
At any rate, I think most people can relate to that, and if not, hopefully they'll have the experience. I think most good saints have had experiences like that. And the spouse says, "Oh, so you said you received a revelation. What God tell you?" And he says, "Well, we're supposed to move to Missouri." And that's what the word was: go to Missouri or something. But then you say, "But I understood from that, I had this understanding that our family specifically has a calling there, and that we're supposed to meet some people there and get involved in teaching the youth or something." I mean, but those were the words. That was just understanding that you had why you're supposed to go. And see, when Joseph's receiving a vision like DNC 76, it's so vast and expansive. How many things were like that? So when
Right.
I read the poetic rewrite, I see Joseph saying, "Oh, here's a little detail I didn't mention the first time. Here's a little something extra too, and let me throw this in and see if it makes you ponder a little bit." Because there's so much more there that he wanted to share, and didn't feel the saints were ready for. So, excuse me, I don't know. That wasn't the most eloquent
No,
series of
that was great.
thoughts I've had.
No, that was good. I think, as you've talked about it, and it's something that I've believed for a long time based off of evidence I saw, we're awfully unfair to Joseph Smith in our assumptions sometimes,
Yeah. Yep.
right? Because, as I was a young Mormon just coming into the LDS church, I had this idea that God would impart a revelation to Joseph, and Joseph understood everything about that revelation that he just
Right.
received, right? And we
Yeah.
do not give Joseph Smith the grace to grow
Right.
as we would require for ourselves, right? We would say, and so when things look like they're contradictions, well, they're not contradictions. It's just he's getting further revelation on the revelation he received previously. And that is absolutely part of this revelatory process. It's not often, I think, you can look in the restoration and not see revelation grow upon revelation. And it was true
Yeah.
for Joseph. It's true for us. Cut the guy some slack.
Yeah.
You know,
Actually, he used the wrong word.
right,
He said salvation, but he meant exaltation.
right.
Um,
Absolutely. So, Drew, dude, you've been a busy man. Good stuff. I can't wait to see this thing. So,
yeah, I hope it's really well received. One of the guys in the funders, as it were, and he might not care if I share his name. I don't know. I tend to be too
sure.
respectful of people's privacy sometimes, but regardless, he got a copy and he's like, "Man, I don't want to use anything else anymore." It's just so nice seeing everything there that Joseph did and what his changes were, and let me just look at the raw text itself and ponder from there. And kind of it didn't realize how many assumptions he was making reading different versions and so forth, or how much it bothered him to not know.
Right.
um so I'm hoping it's impactful for like that for a lot of people. I it's been almost a year of poverty for me doing this project, and or still not charging a lot. Like I said, on the paperback, so if people are poor, they can get it dirt cheap, as cheap as we can get it. Um, so it's not been a big money thing, that frankly I kind of needed at the time, but we got supported through the process. But the ultimate goal, however, is I'm just I would love to see 50,000 copies burn up, and
Yeah,
and know that it's it's being used and received and valued, and because I really do think, even if you use another set of scriptures as your primary thing right now, because it's got cross references and all that sort of stuff, there's so much value in just
absolutely.
the original fountain version of it that you can also cross reference, and you can also see what was changed. And uh, at any rate, I hope it's well loved.
That's yeah, no, I'm sure it will be, Drew. I think we've needed our own stuff for a while. And as fundamentalists, we've absolutely needed that. And I do think that good things are on the horizon there. So the triple that's bounded by leather, that won't be available till this summer. Is that correct? Is that what I remember you saying?
Yeah, that's our hope.
Okay. Okay.
And partly that's dependent on me getting off my duff and getting the Pearl Grey price out fast.
Okay.
And part of that's funding and printing time and that sort of thing. And we don't have a strong timetable, but we're really really hoping to get that done as fast as possible. And now that the all the punctuation stuff is behind me, I think I could put it a lot faster.
Good deal. And then the hardback and the softback is available on Amazon now. Is that correct?
Correct. Amazon gave me some grief about the 87 Revelations paperback published separately. They want me to do something they didn't request for me to do on the hardback, so I've got to go uh, make some time there. And there's another one that they've got some gripe about that isn't quite out, but and I think that's just a digital version.
Okay.
But I think the hardback and paperback are pretty much available for everything now, and or will be super soon. I do know that if you want the DNC that's just got everything, that's good. Hardback, paperback. You want the Book of Mormon hardback, paperback, that's good. You want the specialty one that doesn't have Joseph's stuff in it. That's the one I think that has a paperback problem, possibly in the 87 by itself, but the one that's just DNC but doesn't have the 87 Revelations, I think that one's good in both of those.
Perfect.
Sorry, that's probably too much detail.
No, no, it's good.
That's how
It's
I
good.
think.
All right, folks, go to Amazon or go to 1830mercantile.org, and those are there. Go grab them. We've needed our own stuff for a while, and this is a big part of it is our own scriptures. So go grab it. You like Drew said, even if it's not your primary version, you're gonna want something that's closer to the font, the fountain, right? The where the waters aren't so muddy. So go get that stuff. Drew, you're I don't know how you do it, dude. I struggle to get a podcast out a week, and you're just cranking out books like it's nobody's business. So, well, man, let's do it again soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Sure,
Thanks for
sure
your
have
time,
fun
bud.
talking to you, Dave.
You
Love you.
too,
God
man.
bless.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.